There are moments in the pre-dawn hours of
winding
April
tapestry
26,
of human history that are not
1986,
merely
a
events,
silent
but
invisible
echoes.
force was unleashed
They are
upon
whispers
the world,
across millennia,
an event that would
carrying
forever
the weight of
change the
choices
global
made on
conversation about
blood-soaked
technology
fields,
and the
safety,
enduring
and
spirit
the
of
very
those
nature
who
of
dared to
human
stand
responsibility.
against the tide. Imagine
The
a
story
time
of
when the
marathons
immense
is
power
one
of
such
the atom,
echo,
once
a
the stuff
resonant
of science
chord that
fiction
still
and
vibrates
military
in the
ambition,
halls of
have
Western
been harnessed for
civilization.
peaceful purposes.
It is more than
promising
just
a
a
future
battle.
of limitless,
It is the genesis
clean
of an
energy.
idea.
The
Across
forging
the
of a
Soviet
nascent
Union,
experiment
a vast
in
network of
governance
nuclear
against the
power
might
plants
of a colossus
symbolized this promise.
To understand
a
its
testament to the
profound
nation's
significance,
technological
we must
prowess
first
and its
travel back,
unwavering belief
not to the
in
year
scientific
490
progress.
BCE,
Yet,
but to the
within
very
this
essence
towering
of what defined
edifice
the
of
world
industrial
at that time.
ambition lay a fatal
This was a
flaw,
world of
a
kings
dangerous
and emperors,
cocktail of
poor
sprawling
design,
empires
systemic
built on
failures,
conquest,
and a culture of
tribute,
secrecy
and the
that would,
unquestionable
in a
will
single
of a single
catastrophic
man,
moment, turn
the
that
Persian
promise
Empire,
into a nightmare.
the Achaemenid dynasty,
The world was
the
about to learn a
undisputed monarch
brutal
of this
lesson.
world.
That the
From the
power of
sun-baked
nuclear
plains of
energy,
Egypt
when
to the
mismanaged
fertile
and
valleys of the
misunderstood,
Indus,
holds
their
a
power
destructive
stretched across
potential
3
that
continents,
defies
a
imagination.
sprawling mosaic of
The
conquered
disaster at the
peoples,
Chernobyl
diverse
nuclear
cultures,
power plant
and
was not an act
unimaginable
of
wealth.
nature, nor was it
At
a
its
simple
heart lay the
accident.
great cities of
It was the
Susa
culmination
and
of a
Persepolis,
series of
monuments of
cascading
an
failures,
absolute
a
authority
chain of
that
events
had
set
no
in
equal.
motion by human error,
The great king,
exacerbated
Darius
by a flawed
I,
reactor
ruled
design,
with a divine
and
mandate,
concealed by
his
a
word
culture
law,
of institutional
his armies an
arrogance.
unstoppable force
The
that had
disaster
crushed
itself,
every foe.
a steam explosion followed by a graphite fire.
His
Was
empire was a
physical
model of
manifestation of a
efficiency
deeper,
and
more
organization,
profound
with a
failure
vast
of
road
judgment,
system and
a
oversight.
unified currency,
For
and a
days,
complex
an
bureaucracy
invisible
that held it
cloud
all
of
together.
radioactive particles
Against
was carried
this
on the
overwhelming
wind.
tide
A silent
stood a
poison
collection
that
of
drifted
small
across the
city-states
continent
on the rugged
contaminating
peninsula of
land,
Greece.
water, and air.
They were not a
and leaving
unified
trail
nation,
of
but a
sickness
patchwork
and
of fiercely
fiercely independent
polis.
The
Often
world
at war
watched
with
in
each other
horror
over
as the
land,
Soviet Union,
trade,
in a
or
desperate
honor.
and clumsy
They
attempt
shared a
to
common
contain the
language,
damage
a
and the
pantheon
truth,
of gods,
struggled to
and a
confront
deep
a crisis
sense
of Hellenic
of
identity.
unprecedented
But their
scale.
political systems were
Yet,
wildly
within
divergent.
this overwhelming
Sparta
chaos
was a
and the
militaristic
profound
tragedy,
a
a
state
different,
forged in the
more
crucible
inspiring
of
story
discipline
emerged.
and war. It was a story of extraordinary human
Thebes was a
sacrifice,
regional power,
of ordinary
vying for
men
influence
and
in
women
Central
who,
Greece.
with little knowledge
But
of
it was
the
Athens,
invisible enemy
the
they
city-state
faced,
that would
stepped
become the
into the
crucible
breach
of
to
this
prevent
tale,
an
that
even
was the
greater
true
catastrophe.
anomaly.
These
Just
were
a few
the
decades
liquidators.
before,
An army
Athens
of
had cast
firefighters,
off its own
soldiers,
tyrants
and
embarked
miners
on a radical,
and engineers
untested path,
with little more
a
than
government of the
rudimentary
people,
protection
by the people,
and an unwavering sense
This was
of duty,
Cleisthenes'
fought a
great
silent,
experiment,
invisible
the birth of
war
democratia,
against radiation.
a system where
Their
citizens,
bravery,
for the first
often
time in
performed
history,
without full
held the
knowledge
reins of their
lethal
own
consequences.
Break
Stands
time
as a
equals
testament
0
to the remarkable human
25s
capacity for courage and
/
selflessness.
This fledgling
in the face
democracy,
of unimaginable
fragile
danger.
and imperfect as it was,
Their stories
was a direct
filled with
affront
both
to the very
heroism and
foundation
profound
of the
tragedy,
Persian
are a
Empire's
central
ideology.
part of the Chernobyl
For
narrative.
Darius,
A powerful
the idea of
counterpoint
common
to the
men
failures of the
voting,
system they
debating,
served.
and governing themselves
This
was
is the
not just a
definitive
political
chronicle
oddity.
of the Chernobyl
It was a
disaster.
dangerous heresy,
A story that intertwines
it was a threat
the
to the
sterile,
natural order
terrifying
of things,
logic
a
of
virus
nuclear
that could
physics
infect
with
his
the
own
deeply
subjects
human
and
narratives
challenge
of
his
those
divine
caught in
right
its
to
wake.
rule.
It
The
is a
stage
story
was
that
set,
reveals the
not
delicate
just for a
balance
clash of
between
arms,
progress
but
and
for a
peril,
clash of worlds.
between scientific
On
ambition
one
and
side,
the absolute
the
necessity of
established
safety
monolithic
and
power of
transparency.
an empire that
We
saw
will
the
delve
world
into the
as its
fatal
own to
flaws of the
command.
reactor.
The
On
chain
the
of
other,
events
a
that
small,
led to the
vibrant
explosion,
city-state,
the heroic
a speck on the
sacrifices
map,
of the liquidators,
gambling on a
and
new
the
idea,
immense, a notion
ongoing
that the human
efforts to
spirit
contain the
could be
legacy
trusted
of
to
a
guide its
catastrophe.
own fate.
The
The
Chernobyl
conflict would be
disaster
ignited
stands
by
as a
seemingly
monumental
minor
warning,
event,
a
the
permanent
Ionian
reminder
revolt.
that with the awesome
The
power
Greek
of nuclear
cities of
energy
Asia
comes an
Minor,
equally
chafing
awesome
under Persian
responsibility
rose
to
up
manage
in
it with humility,
499
honesty,
BCE.
and an unwavering
Athens,
commitment,
moved
to
by a
human
sense
safety.
of kinship and
It
shared
is a
Hellenic
story that
identity,
asks us to
sent a small
confront our
force
own
of ships
fallibility
to aid their
and to
brethren.
learn from the lessons
Though
of
the
a silent
revolt was
disaster
eventually
that
and brutally
continues to
crushed,
resonate
this
across
act
the
of
decades.
defiance was an unpardonable sin.
To truly
in the eyes of
comprehend the
Darius.
catastrophic events of
He would
April
not forget the
26,
6th,
1986.
He would not forgive
One
this
must
challenge
first
to his
delve
authority.
into the very heart of
He
the
would teach
Chernobyl
the
nuclear
upstart
power plant,
Athenians a lesson,
the RBMK,
and in doing
1,000
so,
reactor,
he would extinguish
a
the
machine
dangerous
of
flame
immense
of
power,
democracy
yet
before it could
fatally
spread.
flawed in its design.
The shadow of his revenge was
specific
long,
type of
and in
reactor,
492
a product of Soviet
BCE,
engineering,
the first
and Cold
Persian
War era
expedition,
priorities,
a massive
technological
naval and land
paradox,
force,
was sent
it
towards
was
Greece,
capable of producing
only to be
both
shattered by a
vast amounts of
storm
electricity
off the coast of
and,
Mount Athos.
as a byproduct,
But
plutonium
Darius
for the
was a
Soviet
man of
nuclear weapons
implacable will.
program.
but it lacked
not
the
be
fundamental safety features that were
The stage
standard
was
in
set for
Western
the
nuclear
second
designs.
and far more fateful
The disaster at
Persian
Chernobyl
invasion.
was not a random
This time,
occurrence.
the
It was a
destination was
predictable,
clear,
almost
the objective
inevitable
singular.
consequence
Athens.
of a design philosophy
The coming
that
storm was not
prioritized
just a
production
military
and expediency
campaign
over
It was a
safety
verdict on
and
the
human
future of an
oversight.
idea.
The
test to
RBMK,
see if a government of the people could
or
truly
reactor
survive
Bolshoi
in a world
Mashnosti
ruled by
Kanalny.
kings. High-power channel
The
type
sands of
reactor
Marathon
was a
would soon
graphite
drink the
moderated
blood of this
water-cooled
great
reactor.
clash. A moment that
Unlike
would
the
define the
pressurized
destiny
water
of a
reactors,
fledgling democracy,
PWRs,
and
used in much of the
turn,
Western
the
world,
course of
which
Western
use
history
water
itself.
as both a coolant
The
and a
story
moderator.
of Marathon,
The RBMK
therefore,
used graphite
is not a
blocks
tale
to
of
mere
moderate,
conquest,
slow down,
but a profound
the neutrons
and
in the
timeless
nuclear
drama
chain
about
reaction
the
and
audacity
light
of
water
human
to cool
freedom.
the fuel.
It is the story
This
of a
design
small
had a
city
critical
that stood
and
on the
precipice
profoundly
of
dangerous
annihilation,
characteristic
and through
known
courage,
as a positive
ingenuity,
void coefficient.
and a belief in something
a positive
greater
void
than
coefficient
themselves
meant that as the
managed to
cooling
alter
water
the
in the
fate
reactor
of the
core
world.
turned into
Break time
steam,
equals
a
zero.
void. The graphite
25s
moderator's
forward
effectiveness
slash.
increased.
The air
causing
in the nuclear
year
chain
490
reaction
BCE
to
was
accelerate
thick
and
with
the
a
reactor's
palpable
power
tension,
to surge
a foreboding
uncontrollably.
quiet before the tempest.
In a stable,
The
safe
whispers
reactor,
of Persian
the void
retribution
coefficient would
had
be
become
negative,
a roar,
meaning that a
carried
loss
on
of
the wind
coolant
from
would
the
slow
east.
down the reaction.
The great
a
King
natural
Darius
safety
I,
mechanism.
a ruler of
The
immense
RBMK
ambition
design,
and
by
implacable
contrast,
pride, had
not
not forgotten the
feedback loop
Athenian
that would
insult
amplify
during
an
the Ionian
operational
revolt.
error into a runaway
He saw
power
the small,
excursion,
distant
a design
polis
flaw
as a
so
persistent
profound that it
thorn
was a
in his
constant,
side,
a
ticking
dangerous
time bomb
beacon
within
of
the
rebellion
reactor core
that needed to be snuffed
Furthermore,
out.
the RBMK
This
design
was not
lacked
merely
a
a
crucial
punitive
safety
expedition.
feature that was
It was a
standard in
declaration,
Western reactors,
a demonstration of
containment building.
absolute power meant to remind
Western
the world
reactors
that
are
defiance
enclosed
of
in
the
massive,
Achaemenid throne was met with
steel-reinforced
swift
concrete
and
domes
brutal
designed to
consequences.
contain any
The
radioactive
immense
release
Persian
in the
armada was
event
a
of
sight
an
to
accident.
behold.
A fleet
The
of
Chernobyl
hundreds
reactor,
of triremes
however,
and transports
was housed in
its
its sails like a
conventional
menacing
industrial
cloud
building,
on the horizon.
with no robust containment
Under the
structure
command
to
of the
prevent a
seasoned
release
General
of radioactive
Datus and the
material
young,
into the
ambitious
atmosphere.
Artafernes.
This
The
lack
force
of
was
a
a
multi-ethnic
multi-ethnic
tapestry
that once
of
the
Darius's
reactor core
vast
was
empire.
breached,
The release
Medes,
of radioactive
Persians,
material into the
Scythians,
environment was
Bactrians,
inevitable and
men from
catastrophic,
every corner
with
of the
nothing
known
to
world.
mitigate the
Their
fallout.
diverse armaments
The
glinting
absence of this
under the
key safety
Mediterranean
feature
sun.
was a direct consequence
Their
of the
objective was
Soviet
clear:
design
to
philosophy,
sail across the
which
Aegean,
prioritized a
land on the
low-cost,
Attic Peninsula,
easy-to-construct
and
model
bring the
that would
insolent
meet the nation's
Athenians to their
ambitious
knees.
energy goals. First, they
Another
swept
fatal
through the
flaw in the
Cyclades,
RBMK
island
design
hopping
lay
and
in its
demanding
control
earth and
rods,
water,
the very
a symbolic
devices meant
act
to
of
submission
control
to the
and
great
shut
king.
down the nuclear reaction.
Naxos fell.
Its
The
city
control
burned
rods
to the
were
ground.
long,
Boron-tipped rods
Eritrea,
designed
a
to
city
absorb
that had
neutrons
also dared to
and
aid
slow
the
the
reaction,
reaction, was next.
However,
the
the
tips of these
Persians
rods were
besieged
made
the
of
city,
graphite,
and despite
which,
a valiant
as a moderator,
defense,
a betrayal
accelerated
from
the chain
within
reaction.
led to its downfall.
When the operators attempted
The
to perform
Eritreans
an
were
emergency
captured and
shutdown
their
by
temples were
inserting the
desecrated,
control rods,
a grim message
the graphite
sent to
tips
any
of the
other
rods,
Greek city-state
as they
that
entered
might
the
consider
reactor core
resistance.
before the boron absorbers.
The fate of
caused a
Eritrea was a
momentary
chilling
but
portent
dramatic
of what
surge
awaited
in power.
Athens. An effect
The
known
next stop
as
on
the
the Persian
gram-positive
itinerary
effect.
was Athens itself.
This sudden
city
power
that now
surge,
stood alone
a direct
against the
consequence
mightiest
of a flawed
empire the
control
world
rod
had
design,
ever known.
was the final,
The sheer
fatal
scale
trigger
of the
that
Persian
initiated
force
the
was
chain
meant
of
to be a
events
psychological
leading to the
weapon.
explosion. An overwhelming
The
show
RBMK
of force
reactor at
designed to
Chernobyl
break
was
the
a
will of
monument
their
to a
enemies before a
dangerous
single
and
blow was
ultimately
struck.
hubristic design.
And it worked on many.
It was a
but
machine
not
that
on
was
the
inherently
Athenians.
unstable,
Back in Athens,
unforgiving of
the
human
atmosphere
error,
was one of
and lacked the
feverish
most
debate
basic
and
safety
desperate
features.
preparations.
Its
The
design
city
was
still
still
in
the
early
command
fragile
economy
years
that
of its
prioritized
democratic
production
experiment.
targets over safety.
The
A
assembly,
system that
the
discouraged
ecclesia,
transparency
was the
and
heart of the
criticism.
city's life.
The
A
men who
bustling
operated the
forum where
reactor on
every
that
citizen
fateful
had a
night were
voice,
not fully
a vote,
aware of the
and a
extent
say
of
in
these
the affairs of the
flaws.
state. As much of the
It was here
information
that
was
the future of
classified
Athens
or
was
simply
being
ignored.
fiercely debated.
The Chernobyl
The city was
disaster was
divided.
not just an accident.
Some argued for
it
a
was a
desperate,
systemic failure,
final stand
a
within
tragic
the city
culmination
walls,
of a design
believing that their
philosophy
fortified
that,
city
in its
could
pursuit
withstand
of
a siege.
power and ambition,
Others
built a
more
machine
pragmatic,
with a deadly,
argued for
and
evacuating the
ultimately
city
unavoidable
and confronting
flaw
the Persians
at
at
its
sea.
core, where their superior
The
naval
RBMK
skills
reactor
might
was a
give them an
ticking time
advantage.
bomb.
And on
There
April
were even some
26,
who, fearing the
1886,
inevitability
that bomb
of defeat,
finally went off. Advocated for submission.
The RBMK
a course that would
reactors
mean the
designed
end of their
flaws,
cherished
while
freedom.
critical,
Lay
in the
dormant
midst
for
of
years,
this internal
a potential
turmoil,
for disaster,
a
waiting for
remarkable
the right
figure rose to
confluence of
prominence,
circumstances to be
Miltiades.
unleashed. That
Miltiades
confluence
was a
occurred on
man
the
of
night
complex
of April
background,
26th,
an Athenian
1986,
noble who had once
during
ruled
a
a
routine
small
but
but
flawed
safety
safety
test,
test, Thracian
a series of
as
human
a
errors
Persian
and
vassal.
procedural
He had
violations
seen
that
the
would
Persian
push the
army
already
up close,
unstable
understood
reactor
their
past
strength
its
and,
breaking point.
more importantly,
This
their
ill-fated
weak-fated
test,
a testament
he had an
to a
intimate
culture
knowledge
of
of their
arrogance
tactics
and a
and their
dangerous
mindset.
disregard for safety
His
protocols.
voice
Was the
calm but
direct
authoritative,
catalyst for the
cut through
world's
the clamor
worst
of the
nuclear
assembly.
disaster.
The tragedy of Chernobyl was not just a failure
believing
of a
that the
machine.
Persian
It was a
cavalry
failure
would
of
be
the human
devastating
system
in the
that
open
operated
plains
it.
of Athens.
The purpose of the test
proposed
was,
a bold,
ironically,
audacious plan
to improve the
to meet the
reactor's
Persians
safety.
on the plains of Marathon.
Operators were
a coastal
attempting to
plain
test a new
25
system
miles
that would use the
northeast of
residual
Athens.
energy from a spinning
Marathon was an
turbine to
ideal
power the
location
reactor's
for a
coolant
battle of
pumps
its
in the
design.
event of an emergency
The
shutdown
plains,
and a
flanked
loss
by
of
external
hills
power,
and a marsh.
This
Would
test
naturally
was meant
funnel
to
the
simulate a
immense
power
Persian
failure,
force,
a station
neutralizing their
blackout,
feared
to see if the
cavalry
backup
and forcing
cooling
them
system
into
would
a head-on
function as
confrontation with the
The
Athenian
test,
infantry.
however,
This was a
poorly
gamble
planned,
of the highest
poorly
order,
managed,
and was being
It meant
conducted
leaving the
under
safety of the
immense
city
time
walls
pressure and
as the
marching
plant's
to face the
managers were
Persian
eager
army
to
head-on,
complete the test
a move
before a
that many
scheduled
considered
shutdown.
suicidal. This rush
But
to meet
Miltiades'
Miltiades'
conviction,
conviction,
a common
combined
feature
with his
in the
strategic
Soviet
foresight,
industrial system,
won over the
led to a
assembly.
series of shortcuts
The decision
and
was made.
dangerous procedural
Athens
violations.
would march.
The
As
chain
the
of
city
errors
mobilized,
began when
its
operators
citizens,
started
from
the
humble
test
farmers
without the
to
proper
wealthy
authorization,
aristocrats,
a blatant
prepared for
violation
war.
of safety protocols.
The heart of the Athenian army,
The
was
reactor's
the
power
hoplite,
was then
the
lowered
citizen
to
soldier.
a dangerously low level.
These were
a
not
condition that
professional
was known to
warriors,
make
but
the
men who
RBMK
lived
reactor
and worked in the
highly
city,
unstable,
who owned their
and
own farms
unpredictable,
and businesses,
a fact that was
and who were
not
now
fully
taking up
understood
arms
by
to
the
defend their
operators.
homes, their
The
families,
positive void
and the radical
coefficient,
idea
the
of their
fatal
democracy.
flaw in the reactor's
They
design,
were equipped with a
was at
heavy
its most
bronze
dangerous
shield,
in
the
this low-power
aspes
state.
or hoplon.
The operators,
spear,
in their
and a
attempt to
sword.
raise the power back
Their
up,
strength lay
disabled
not
several
in
of the
individual
reactor's
prowess,
key emergency
but in their
and
collective
automatic
discipline,
shutdown
in
systems,
their ability to
including
fight
the
as a
emergency
cohesive
core
unit
cooling system,
known as the phalanx.
They were operating in a
The
condition
phalanx
that
was
was
a
in
gross
gross violation
formation,
of safety
a wall of
regulations,
bronze shields
essentially
and
flying
spear
blind in
points,
a machine
an
that was
impenetrable
already
hedge of
teetering
steel
on the
that
edge of a
moved as one.
catastrophe. The
As the test
Athenians knew
proceeded,
they were
the
outnumbered.
reactor became
Perhaps by as
increasingly
many as
unstable,
2 or 3
a fact
to
that
1,
was clearly
but they had a
indicated by
crucial
the control
advantage.
room instruments.
They were fighting for something tangible.
The operators,
something
in
they
their
had created
arrogance
and
and their
cherished.
belief in their own control,
This was not a fight for
chose
a king
to ignore
or for
these
conquest,
warnings,
but for
believing
their
that they
very
could
way of
manage
life.
the reactor manually.
And in their moment
They
of
pulled out
greatest
a
peril,
dangerously
they did
large
not
number of
stand
control
entirely
rods.
alone.
The very devices
An urgent
meant
plea
to
for
control
help
the
was sent
reaction
to Sparta,
to raise the power
preeminent
back up.
military power of
The
Greece.
reactor was now operating
A renowned
with a
runner,
bare minimum of
Phidippides,
control rods,
was dispatched,
a condition that
covering
was
the
explicitly
incredible
forbidden
distance
by
of over
safety
150
regulations.
miles in just
The final
2 days.
fatal error occurred
He delivered
just
the
after
message,
1:23
a desperate
a.m.
cry for aid against
As the test
common
was
enemy.
nearing its end.
The
However,
operators pressed the
Spartans,
emergency
bound by their
shutdown button,
religious
known as
festivals,
the
the
AZ5
Carnea,
button,
refused to
a
march
last-ditch effort
until
to
the
shut
next
down the
full
reactor.
moon.
This
However,
refusal, due to the
born of
flawed
strict
design of the
tradition,
control
meant
rods
that the
with their graphite
Athenians would
tips,
have to face
this
the Persian
action,
force alone,
instead of shutting
or
down
at
the
least with
reactor,
only one
caused
ally.
a massive,
The
momentary
small,
power
but
surge,
resolute,
as the graphite
city-state of
tips
Plataea,
entered the core,
a long-standing
and
ally
accelerated
of
the chain
Athens,
reaction, sent a contingent of
This
about
sudden
1,000
power excursion
hoplites to join
amplified
the
by
Athenian
the
force.
positive void coefficient.
This act
caused
of
the reactor
loyalty
to go
and
into an
courage, though
uncontrollable,
small in numbers,
prompt
was a
criticality.
profound psychological
The heat generated
boost for
was
the
so
Athenians.
immense that it caused the
The
cooling
Athenian
water to
and
flash
Plataean
into
forces,
steam,
a total
triggering
of perhaps
a massive
10,000
steam
men,
explosion
marched
that
out of
blew
the city
the
and towards
1,000-ton
Marathon.
concrete lid off the reactor
As they took their
and
positions
ruptured
on the
the fuel
hills
channels.
overlooking the plain,
This
they
was
could see
followed
the
by a
vast
second,
Persian
more
camp,
powerful
a sea
explosion,
of tents
a
and
hydrogen
banners
explosion
stretching to the
caused
sea.
by the reaction
The moment
of
of truth
superheated
was
steam.
at hand.
With the zirconium
The stage
alloy
was
of the
set.
fuel rods,
The armies
which
were in
tore apart
position,
the reactor
and
building
history
and
was holding
exposed
its
the core
breath.
to the atmosphere.
The Athenian hoplites,
The ill-fated test
standing
was
on
over,
those hills,
but the disaster
looked down
was just
upon the
beginning.
immense force
The
of
catastrophic
an empire
chain
built
of
on
errors,
conquest, born
an
of a
empire
culture
that
that
had
had
never
arrogance,
known defeat.
systemic failures. They were
and a
not
disregard
professional
for
soldiers,
safety,
but
had
citizens
unleashed the
defending their
destructive power
freedom,
of nuclear
their
energy
homes,
upon
and
the
their
world.
radical idea of a
The
government
men
of
in the
people.
control room,
Though
the
ultimately
coming battle would
scapegoated
be
by
a
the
test of
Soviet
their
authorities,
courage, their
were as
discipline,
much victims
and
of
their
the flawed
belief in a
system
cause
they
far
operated
greater
as they
than
were its
themselves.
perpetrators. It would be a
The
battle
Chernobyl
that would
disaster
not
was a
only
testament
decide
to
the
the fate of
fact that
Athens,
even the most
but would shape the
complex
very
and powerful
foundations of
technologies
Western
are
civilization
only as
for
safe
millennia to
as the
come.
human systems that
The stillness
design
of the
and
dawn
operate
was
them.
about to be broken by the clash
ill-fated
of
test
bronze
was a
and
tragic
the roar of
reminder
men.
that hubris,
and the name
in the
Marathon
face of
would
immense
forever
power,
be etched
is
into
a
the
fatal
annals
flaw.
of time as the place where an idea,
In the immediate
immediate,
fragile
chaotic
as a
moments
new spring
following the
leaf,
explosions
stood firm
a small,
against the storm.
courageous group of men
The
became
two armies
the first
stood
line
like
of defense
titanic
against an
statues
invisible
carved into the
and lethal
landscape,
enemy,
a
an
tableau
enemy
of
they could
opposing
not
wills
see,
on the plain
smell,
of Marathon,
or feel.
For days,
These were the
an
Chernobyl
eerie
plant
silence had
workers
settled
and
between
the local
hills and the
firefighters,
sea.
ordinary
A stillness
men who,
broken
in
only
their
by the
unwavering
chirping of
commitment
crickets to their
and
duty,
the distant
rushed
murmur
into
of
the heart of
thousands
the
of
disaster,
men,
waiting.
unknowingly
On
walking
the western
into a
side,
death trap
nestled
of
against the
unimaginable
foothills,
radiation
the Athenian
levels.
and Plataean
Their
hoplites
heroic
held their
sacrifice,
ground. performed
They were
with
a
little
wall of
knowledge of the
bronze and
immense
steel,
danger they
their
faced,
heavy shields,
and with no proper
hopla
protective gear.
interlocked
is
in
one
the
of the most
formidable
powerful
phalanx
and tragic
formation.
stories of the Chernobyl
These were not the
disaster,
finely honed,
a testament to the
professional
profound
warriors of
courage
Sparta,
that can
but
emerge
citizen
in the darkest
soldiers,
of moments.
farmers,
The
artisans,
explosions
and
at
merchants who had
1:23
temporarily
a.m.
set
ripped
aside
the
their
roof off
plows
reactor
and their
unit
crafts
4,
to take up
exposing
the
the
spear.
graphite core to the
Their
air
bronze
and igniting
breastplates,
a
helmets
massive
with horsehair
raging fire.
flames,
And
This
Greaves
fire
gave
was
them
not
a
a
uniform
conventional
appearance.
one, but beneath
It was
the
a
armor were men
radioactive
of
distinct
distinct
individual
burning
lives,
at thousands of
united
degrees
by a singular,
and spewing a
burning
toxic
purpose,
cloud of radioactive
the defense of their
particles
homes
into the night
and
sky.
the radical ideal of
The
their
first
democracy.
responders to arrive
Their
were the
position
Chernobyl
was no
plant
accident.
workers, who,
Miltiades,
in a desperate
the
and
brilliant
valiant
strategist,
effort, had
rushed to the
chosen
control
this
room,
ground with the
attempting
precision
to manually
of a master
activate the
craftsman.
reactor's emergency
The hills
systems,
behind them protected
all while
their
the building
flanks,
around them
preventing
was
them from
collapsing,
being
and the
outflanked.
radiation levels were
The marshy
soaring
ground
to
on either
unimaginable
side of the
heights.
plain
acted as a
They were met
natural
with a
barrier,
terrifying
a
scene
bottleneck
of
that would
destruction,
neutralize
with
the
glowing
Persians' greatest
radioactive
asset,
graphite
their cavalry.
and fuel fragments
The
scattered
Athenians
all
held
over
the
the
high
grounds,
ground, and a pervasive,
psychological
eerie
advantage
blue
that
glow
allowed
in
them
the
to
air,
look down
a
upon the
phenomenon
vast,
caused by the
glittering
ionization of
expanse
the
of their
air
enemy.
by the immense levels of
On the
radiation.
eastern side,
Stretching
simultaneously,
towards the shimmering
local firefighters from the nearby
Persian
city
host
of
was a
Pripyat arrived on
kaleidoscopic
the
sea
scene,
of colors
having
and
been
banners.
alerted to a fire at the
Their
power
army
plant.
was a living mosaic of the
These
great
men,
kings
dressed in their
immense
standard
dominion.
firefighting uniforms,
There were the Medes
and with
and
no
Persians,
understanding of the
wearing
nuclear
flowing
nature of the
robes
fire,
and armored
bravely
scale
ascended
jackets,
the roof of
their
the
longbows
adjacent
and
Unit
short
3,
spears
a
poised
roof
for
that was
battle.
covered in radioactive
Scythian horse
graphite
archers,
debris from the
known for their
exploded
deadly
core.
accuracy,
Their
and
task
swift
was to
movements,
extinguish the
stood by
fires
their
on the
steeds.
roofs of the buildings to
There were
prevent
also
the blazers
slingers
from
spreading
spreading
to the other
regions.
three
Their
reactors,
projectiles
a
capable
critical
of
and
striking
heroic
with lethal
effort
force.
that prevented an
The Persian
even
army
greater
was a force
catastrophe.
designed for
For
overwhelming,
hours, they fought the
long-range
blaze
combat
with nothing
and
but
fluid
water
movement,
and a
a
profound
stark
sense of
contrast
duty.
to the rigid,
Their bodies
heavy
absorbing
infantry of the
lethal
Greeks.
doses of radiation.
With
Their
every
numbers were a
passing
testament
moment.
to their empire's
They
power.
were unaware that
A
the
force
water
that
they
had
were
been
spraying
assembled
was
from the
turning
farthest
into
reaches
radioactive
of the known
steam,
world, and their
the dust
commanders
they were
held a
breathing
deep-seated
was a deadly
confidence
cocktail
born
of
of
an
an unbroken
unbroken
string of
isotopes.
conquests. The effects of the
They had
radiation
faced
on
nothing
these
like the
men were
hoplite
swift
phalanx
and brutal.
before,
And in their minds,
they began to
this
experience
small,
the classic
provincial army
symptoms
was
of
merely
acute
another
radiation
obstacle to
syndrome,
be swept
ARS,
aside on the
severe
path
nausea,
to their true
vomiting,
objective, a
the city
metallic
of
taste in their
Athens,
mouths, and a
for what
profound
felt
weakness.
like an eternity.
Their
The two
skin,
forces watched each
particularly the
other.
parts that were exposed
This was
to
a
the
battle of
highest
nerves,
levels of
a
radiation,
psychological
began to
duel
turn a
waged
sickly,
across the
reddish
silent
color,
plain.
a sign of
Miltiades
severe
knew
radiation
that to
burns.
rush into battle would
Despite
be suicide.
these terrifying
The
symptoms,
Persian archers
they
could
continued
rain
to
down
work,
a hailstorm
often
of
in a
arrows
state of
from a distance,
confusion and
decimating the
disorientation,
Athenian ranks
driven by their
before they
training
ever came
and
to
their
grips.
commitment to their duty.
The Persian
Tragically,
cavalry would then
many of these
ride
first
into the
responders
disarrayed
died a
phalanx,
slow and
turning the
agonizing
battle
death in the
into a
weeks
rout.
and months that followed.
He had to wait.
They were
to be
transported
patient,
to
to
specialized
draw the enemy
hospitals,
into a
where
situation
doctors,
where their strengths
many of
would be
whom were
negated.
also unaware of
He
the
gambled
full
on the
extent of
Persian
the radiation
impatience,
exposure,
on their
did their
strategic
best to treat them.
overconfidence.
He
Their
knew that the
bodies,
Persians had
having
a crucial
absorbed
decision
doses
to
of
make.
radiation that were
The
thousands
massive
of times
armada of
higher
transports
than the
and
lethal
warships was
began
a
to break
complex
down
logistical
at a
challenge,
cellular level,
and leaving it anchored at
their
Marathon
bone marrow
for
was
too long
destroyed.
was a risk.
Their immune systems
They had
collapsed,
sailed to conquer
and their skin
Athens,
peeled off
not
in
to sit
sheets.
idly on a barren
They were
plain.
heroes who,
The psychological
tragic
pressure of this
sacrifice,
stalemate was
bore the
immense,
full brunt of the
especially on the
disaster.
Athenian side. The first responders
Every
to the
day,
Chernobyl
the Athenian
disaster were
council
not
of
just
10
generals.
They
They
were
were
martyrs,
martyrs,
met
the
to
first
debate the course
casualties
of
of a
action.
new and terrifying kind
Under
of
the
war.
law of their new democracy,
Their story is a
each
powerful
general
and
was to
sobering
hold command
reminder
for
of
a
the
single
profound
day
dangers of
rotation.
nuclear energy
Miltiades,
and the immense courage
a
that is
man with the
required to
keenest
confront it.
strategic mind.
Their
found himself
sacrifice
in a
made
frustrating
in the
position,
initial,
having to
chaotic
persuade
moments
his
of the
colleagues of
disaster,
his plan,
prevented an even
his allies
greater
were
catastrophe,
his
and
detractors
provided a
many.
crucial,
Some
albeit
generals,
tragic,
terrified
example
by the
of the
sheer
human
numbers of the
spirit's
Persian
capacity
force,
for selflessness,
argued for a retreat back to
the
the
first
city walls.
responders, in their
Others
heroic
wanted to
and
wait for the
tragic
Spartans to
sacrifice,
arrive,
became a
hope
permanent
that was
fixture
quickly
in the
fading.
story of Chernobyl.
The decisive
A
voice
silent,
in this council
powerful
belonged to the
testament to the
Polemarch,
human cost of a
Callimachus,
systemic
the commander-in-chief,
chief, whose
as the
vote
full
could break a
scale of the
tie.
disaster disaster became terrifyingly clear. With the weight of the Soviet Union mobilized a massive, made a passionate, unprecedented human response to contain the catastrophe. He argued that to retreat would be to admit defeat. This was the army to allow the Persians to ravage the countryside force of over 600,000 which would almost from all walks of life. The only chance for victory, engineers, scientists, was to fight now, and civilians on this ground, who were sent into the lethal embrace of the Chernobyl exclusion zone, and with it, the future of this fledgling democracy rested on Callimachus' story is one of profound and often coerced in a moment that would forever be of a national effort to contain a disaster that was a direct result of the very system they were now being asked to engage. Their immense
Miltiades
courage,
did not
born of
immediately
both
seize
duty
command.
and necessity,
In an
became a
extraordinary
testament
act of
to a nation's
self-restraint
desperate
and
attempt
leadership,
to clean
the
up
generals
its
who
own
had
mess.
voted with him voluntarily
The tasks of the
ceded their
liquidators
days
were
of command
varied
to him,
and incredibly
giving him the
dangerous.
authority to wait for the
The
opportune
immediate
moment.
priority was to contain the
This act
radioactive
of
fire
trust,
in the reactor
a testament
core,
to the new
a task
democratic
that was
spirit,
initially attempted
allowed
by
for a
dropping
unified
thousands of
command
tons of
and a
sand,
coherent strategy,
boron,
a
clay,
sharp
and lead
contrast
from
to the
helicopters,
often divided leadership
brave
of
but
other Greek
ultimately
city-states.
ineffective effort.
The
As much
strategic
of the
stalemate
material
was
missed the
finally
core.
broken by the Persians
The liquidators
themselves.
were then tasked with
On the
building
morning
a
of the battle,
massive,
a
temporary
curious change
concrete
was observed in the
sarcophagus
Persian camp
to entomb the destroyed
the formidable
reactor
Persian
and contain the
cavalry,
radioactive
which had been
material.
grazing in the plains for
This
days,
was a Herculean
noticeably
effort,
absent.
performed under immense
Historians have
pressure
long
and in a
debated the
lethal
reason for their
environment.
absence. One of the most
This information
dangerous
has
jobs
not
was
been
clearing the
verified,
highly
but it is
radioactive
believed that the
graphite
Persians,
debris from the
growing
roof of the
impatient,
adjacent Unit
had begun
3,
the process
a
of
task
loading
that was
their
initially
cavalry onto
attempted
ships,
by remote-controlled
perhaps with
robots.
the intention of sailing
However,
around to attack
the intense
undefended
radiation
city
levels
of Athens
quickly
while
destroyed the
Athenian
robot's
army was tied
electronics,
down at
leaving the
Marathon.
job to be done by hand.
Whatever the reason,
The moment
in a truly
Miltiades
terrifying
had been waiting for
display
had
of human
arrived.
sacrifice.
The field was now clear of the
known
one
as
force that could
biorobots
shatter the Greek
in this
phalanx.
context,
Were sent onto the
Miltiades'
roof in
gamble had
shifts.
paid off.
With each man given
He
a
gave the
few
order.
minutes to run onto
It
the
was
roof,
the dawn of a
shovel
new
a
day,
single
and the
shovelful
sun
of
rose to
radioactive
illuminate
debris
a
off the
scene
side
of immense
and then
gravity.
run back to safety.
The Athenian
These
and
men,
Plataean
wearing
hoplites,
rudimentary
who had stood
lead
immobile
aprons
for
and
days,
gas masks
were now
that
preparing
offered little
to
to
move.
no protection. Their silence
Absorbed
was about to be
lethal doses of
replaced by the
radiation
rhythmic
in a
tramp
matter
of
of
their
minutes.
marching
A
feet,
profound
the
and
clang of
tragic
bronze,
act of
and the
courage that was a
unified war
direct
cry that was
consequence of
soon
the systemic
echo across the
failures that
plain.
created the disaster.
The long wait was over. The liquidators were
The fate
also
of
tasked
Athens
with
and the fate of
decontaminating
an
the
idea
vast
that had
exclusion
just begun
zone,
to take root,
a 30-kilometer
was to be
area
decided in the
around the
next few
plant
hours.
that was heavily
The
contaminated
clash
with
of worlds
radioactive
was at
fallout.
hand, and the world would
They were
never
tasked
be the
with
same
bulldozing and
Break
burying
time
entire
equals zero.
villages, stripping the
25s
topsoil from vast areas of
/
land.
The
and
dawn of the
killing
fateful
and
day
burying
broke
all
cold
the
and
animals
clear
in the
over
zone.
the plains
A
of
grim
Marathon
and emotionally
painting the scene
devastating
in
task.
hues of gold.
The
and
work
crimson.
was performed under
new
immense
wind,
pressure,
fresh
with little
and
to no
carrying the
proper
scent of the
protective
sea,
gear,
began
and
to
with the
stir.
constant and with
terrifying
the
knowledge
knowledge
that
that
every
every
passing
passing
moment
moment
was
was a dose of radiation.
The Persian
being
cavalry,
absorbed
the
into
single
their bodies.
greatest threat to the
The
Athenian
information about the
phalanx
dangers
was
of
gone.
radiation was
It
often
was a window of
suppressed or
opportunity,
downplayed by
a
the
gift
Soviet
from the gods
authorities,
that could
who
not
were
be
more
wasted.
concerned with controlling
The order was
narrative
given,
than protecting
and a
the
low,
lives of the
guttural
men
murmur
who were
rippled
risking
through the
everything
Athenian
for the
ranks.
cleanup.
The
health
hoplites,
consequences
who had
for the
stood
liquidators
vigilant
were
and silent
immense
for days,
and long-lasting,
began to stir.
Many
A
suffered
living
from
wall
acute
of bronze
radiation
and
syndrome,
resolve.
ARS. Miltiades,
And many
a
more
master
developed
of
various
unconventional
forms of
tactics,
cancer,
had a
including
final,
leukemia,
audacious
thyroid
plan to
cancer,
execute
and a
before the
host of
battle
other
was joined.
radiation-related illnesses.
He knew that the center of
Their
the Persian
story
line
is one
was
of a
its
profound
strongest
and
point,
tragic betrayal,
manned by the elite
as many of them
Persian
were later
and
denied the
infantry.
medical and financial support.
He also
they were
knew that
promised
the
by the
phalanx
Soviet
was
and
strongest
later
when its
Russian
depth was
and
greatest.
Ukrainian governments.
In a move that
They were
defied
heroes
conventional
in
military
1986.
wisdom, he
But
thinned
many
the
became
Athenian
forgotten
center to
victims
just
in
a
the
few
decades that
ranks
followed.
deep. Their
Thereby
illnesses
dismissed
dismissed
by
by
the
the
authorities
to a
as
greater
being
depth.
unrelated to their
This was a
exposure.
high-stakes gamble. The liquidators
The
of
thin
Chernobyl
center
were
was
an
deliberately
army of
weak,
sacrifice,
almost an
a
invitation
testament
for
to
the
the
Persian
immense
forces
courage
to
and
push through.
selflessness of
But
ordinary
Miltiades
people
had a
in the
deeper
face of an
purpose,
invisible,
a strategic
lethal
trap
threat he was laying for his
Their
enemy.
heroic efforts,
The sun was
often
now
performed
fully in the
under
sky,
coercion,
glinting
and with
off
profound
1,000
personal
bronze
sacrifice,
shields as the Greek
prevented an
phalanx
even
began its
greater
advance.
catastrophe and
But
provided
this was
a
no
crucial,
ordinary march,
albeit tragic,
Miltiades
example
gave
of
the
the human
order to
spirit's
charge.
capacity for
It
resilience.
was a distance of perhaps a mile.
Their story
and the
is a
hoplites,
permanent
laden
fixture
with
in the
heavy
narrative
armor
of
and
Chernobyl,
shields,
began
a
to
silent,
run.
powerful testament
This
to
was
the
an
human
unheard of
cost
tactic in
systemic
ancient
failure
warfare,
and the immense
a desperate,
price that was paid to
lung-searing
contain it.
sprint designed to
The
close the
liquidators,
distance
with
in
the
their
Persian
tragic
archers
sacrifice
as quickly as
became
possible.
the living legacy
It was
of
an act of
Chernobyl,
raw courage,
a permanent
and tactical
reminder of the
genius.
profound perils
The Persians,
of nuclear
caught
energy.
completely off guard by this
In the
unexpected
chaotic
ferocity,
aftermath of the disaster,
had no time to
an
ready their
invisible
bows
and lethal
and
boundary
unleash their
was
full
drawn
volley.
around the Chernobyl
The
nuclear
phalanx,
power
a
plant,
solid,
creating a
thundering
permanent
mass of
monument
men,
to the
came
destructive
crashing
power
into the
of
Persian
nuclear
lines
energy
like a tidal
that
wave
Chernobyl
against the
exclusion
shore.
zone.
This
sound was
30-kilometer
immense,
radius
a deafening
around the plant,
cacophony of
a
clashing
landscape
bronze,
of profound
splintering
and eerie
wood,
silence,
and the cries of
was a
men.
microcosm of a
It was a
world that had
moment
been
of
permanently
pure,
altered
brutal
by an
chaos,
invisible poison,
where individual courage
it
met
was a
the
ghostly
collective
landscape
might of a
time
cohesive
capsule of a
formation.
past that was
The
violently
Persian center,
and
just as
irrevocably
Miltiades
interrupted,
had predicted,
a place where
began to
nature,
push back.
in the absence of humanity,
The elite Persian
had begun
and
to
Median
reclaim the
warriors,
land,
fighting
all while
with
the fierce
silent,
determination,
lethal threat
managed
of
to break
radiation
through the
remained.
deliberately weakened
The exclusion
Athenian
zone
line.
stands as a
They
powerful
pressed
and
forward,
chilling testament
jubilant,
to the
believing they
long-lasting
had won the day.
consequences of a single catastrophic
of the Greek
army was in retreat.
The initial
evacuation of the
city
of Crete, a model
must have felt
Soviet
a
city
surge
built
of
for the
triumphant
plant's
confidence.
workers and their families.
But their victory
was a
was a
desperate
mirage.
and clumsy affair.
It was an illusion
In the
woven
hours
by
and days
multitudes
following
to
the
draw them
explosion,
into his trap.
the Soviet authorities,
As the Persian
in a futile
center
attempt
surged
to control
forward,
the narrative
their jubilant
and prevent
cries of
panic,
victory
initially
turned to cries of
downplayed the
alarm.
severity of the disaster.
The reinforced Athenian
But as
wings,
radiation
which had been
levels
fighting
soared
their
to own
unimaginable
fierce battles
heights,
against the
the
Persian
decision was
flanks,
made to
now
evacuate
began
the
to turn
entire
inward.
city of
The
49,000
Athenian
people.
and Plataean hoplites on the
The
left
residents were
and
told
right,
to pack
having
only a
defeated
few
the weaker
belongings,
Persian wings,
as they would only
now
be gone
wheeled
for a
around,
few days,
executing
a lie
a
that was
perfectly
meant to
timed
prevent a
double
full-scale
envelopment.
panic, but which ultimately
The Persians
became
in
a
the
cruel
center and
who had
permanent
broken
deception.
through and were now pushing
The
into
residents
plain,
of Pripyat left
suddenly
their
found
homes,
themselves
their
surrounded,
possessions,
a
and their
mass
pets
of men
behind,
trapped between
a testament
the
to a life that was
walls of the Greek
abruptly
phalanx.
and permanently put on
The
hold.
battle turned into a
Today,
slaughter. The exclusion
the
zone
hoplites,
is a ghostly
fighting with the
landscape
short,
of abandoned
stabbing
cities
sword
and
known
villages,
as the
a
Ziphos,
chilling
were
testament
now in
to
their
the
element.
destructive power of
The Persian
radiation.
infantry,
The
lightly
city of
armored
Pripyat
and primarily
as a
equipped
time
for
capsule
skirmishing
of
and archery,
1986, was no
with
match
Ferris
for the
wheels
brutal,
frozen in time,
close-quarters
abandoned
combat
schools
of the
with
phalanx.
children's books and
Panic
dolls still
began
on
to
the
spread
desks
through the
in
Persian
apartment
ranks.
buildings that are slowly
They were
being
trapped,
reclaimed by
their
nature.
escape routes cut off.
The zone is a
their
place
vaunted
of
numerical
profound
superiority
and
rendered
silence,
useless
with
by the
the only
terrain
sounds
and
being the
militarity's
rustling of
brilliant
leaves
strategy
and the faint hum of
the
the
slaughter
wind.
was immense. The buildings,
The Persians
once
fought with
vibrant
the ferocity
and full
of
of cornered
life,
animals,
now
but
stand
their
as
resistance
empty shells,
was futile.
a silent,
The
powerful
Athenian
testament to
and
a life
Plataean
that was
soldiers,
violently
driven by a
interrupted.
desperate need
The
to protect
radioactive
their homes,
fallout from their
the disaster
families
also
and their
created
liberty
a strange
fought with
and
a zeal that the
terrifying phenomenon
Persians
could not
the Red
comprehend.
Forest.
They were not
A large
fighting for
area
a king.
of pine
They were
forest
fighting
near
for
the
themselves,
plant,
which had absorbed
The battle
the
was
brunt
a
of the
bloody,
radiation,
chaotic
turned a
whirlwind of
reddish
death
brown
and
color,
despair.
and died.
The
A
plain of
physical
Marathon,
manifestation
once a
of the
peaceful
invisible
stretch
poison,
of land,
was
the
now
trees
a
were later
gruesome
bulldozed
tableau of
and
carnage,
buried in a desperate
testament
attempt
to
to
the brutal
contain the
realities
contamination
of ancient
but the
warfare.
forest remains a permanent
Finally,
fixture
the Persian
in the
line
exclusion
broke
zone,
completely.
a silent,
The remaining
and chilling
warriors,
reminder of
those
the
who
destructive
could,
power
fled
of
in a
radiation.
desperate, panicked
Despite
rout
the
towards
lethal
the
levels
ships.
of radiation,
The
nature,
Athenian
in the
hoplites,
absence
their
of
chest
humanity,
heaving, has
their
begun to
faces
reclaim
streaked
the
with
land.
sweat and blood,
The
pursued them
exclusion zone is
relentlessly
now
to the
home to a
shoreline.
wide variety of
The
wildlife.
fighting was brutal
including
at the
wild
ships,
boars, as the
wolves,
Greeks fought to
beavers,
seize the vessels
and rare species
prevent
of
the
birds,
escape of their
a
enemies.
strange and paradoxical
They
testament
managed to capture
the
7
resilience
ships,
of nature.
but the bulk of the Persian
However,
fleet, the
with
animals,
its surviving
while
army,
thriving in the
managed to
absence
get
of human
away.
interference, the
Were
battle was
also
over.
living in a highly
The
contaminated
Athenians and
environment,
their Plataean
with
allies
many of
had
them
achieved
showing
a
signs of
miraculous
genetic
victory.
mutations and
On
other
the blood-soaked
radiation-related
plain,
health
the
problems.
cost was immense. The exclusion
The
zone
Persian
is not a
casualties were
pristine
staggering,
wildlife
with
sanctuary.
historical accounts
It is a
putting the
laboratory
number
for the
as high as
long-term effects of radiation
6,400.
on an entire ecosystem.
The Greeks,
by contrast,
the exclusion
suffered a
zone
mere
stands as a
192
permanent and chilling
Athenian
testament
and
to the
11
long-lasting
losses.
consequences
It
of
was
a
an
single
unbelievable
catastrophic
victory,
event.
a triumph
It
of
is a place
strategy,
where the past,
discipline,
and
present,
a deep-seated
and future
belief
have been
in a cause
forever
far
intertwined
greater than
by an
themselves.
invisible poison. But the fight was not
It
yet
is a
over.
place where humanity's absence
As the
has
exhausted
created a
Athenians
strange
began
and
to tend to
paradoxical
their dead,
landscape,
a chilling
place
discovery
where
was
nature's
made.
resilience is both
The
a
Persian
source of
fleet,
hope and
having
a
escaped
profound
the
warning.
slaughter at Marathon,
The
was
exclusion
not
zone
sailing
is
home
a
in
final
defeat, and most
It
enduring
was rounding Cape
monument
Sounding,
to the
a
destructive
move that would
power
allow
of
them to
nuclear energy,
attack the
a
undefended
silent,
city of
powerful
Athens from
reminder
sea.
of the immense
The
and
Persian
long-lasting
commanders,
cost
having
of a
failed to
single
break the
catastrophic
Athenian army,
mistake, were now attempting
its
to take
ghostly
the city by
landscape will
surprise.
forever stand as a testament
Athens
to
was
a
in peril
world
once
that was
more,
violently
and its exhausted
irrevocably
army,
changed.
having just fought the battle
In the
of their
chaotic
lives,
aftermath
had
of
to
the
make a
disaster,
desperate
with the
march
reactor
back to the
core
city
still
to
a
defend it.
raging,
The race
radioactive
was on.
inferno.
The immediate
The blood of the
priority was to
defeated
contain
still
the
soaked
immense
the
release
sacred
of
plain of
radioactive
Marathon,
material
and the
provide
victorious
some level of
Athenians,
protection
exhausted
to the surrounding
and bruised,
environment. Had barely
The
begun
solution,
to grasp the
conceived
enormity
in a
of their
moment of
triumph
desperate
when a new
necessity,
terror gripped
was
them.
a massive,
As they gathered their
temporary
dead and took
concrete
stock
and
of the
steel
captured
structure
Persian
known
ships,
as the
a signal
sarcophagus,
was sent from
a
the
hastily
hills,
built
a
tomb
flash of
designed
light,
to
a
entomb the
reflection
destroyed
from a
reactor
polished shield,
and its lethal
a
contents.
prearranged message that the
This
Persian
monument
fleet,
to containment,
instead of retreating
a product
into
of immense human effort and profound sacrifice. Their destination was clear. A Herculean effort to contain a disaster of unimaginable scale. They were sailing for the undefended city of Athens. To a nation's desperate attempt chilling revelation ignited a fresh wave of adrenaline. The construction of the sarcophagus was a monumental and victory died on their engineering challenge, replaced by a performed in a unified environment of intense radiation. Their homes, their families, the task fell to the heart of their democracy, an army of soldiers, danger, miners, and engineers who worked in shifts, unflinching with resolve each man that had defined his command to work before being rotated out to limit the army radiation exposure. This was
The
not a
men,
celebratory
wearing
return, but a
rudimentary
desperate,
lead aprons and
forced
gas
march,
masks
a
that
punishing
offered little to
footrace
no
against the
protection,
wind-filled
worked
sails
tirelessly.
of the Persian fleet.
Their bodies absorbing
hoplites,
lethal
who had
doses
just
of
fought a
radiation
brutal,
with every
close-quarters
passing moment.
battle, were now
The
asked
work
to
was
perform
performed
another
under
superhuman
immense
feat
pressure
of endurance.
with the constant,
They strapped their
terrifying
heavy
knowledge
shields
that
to their
every
backs.
passing moment
The
was a
bronze
dose of
and would
radiation
weighing
being
heavily on their
absorbed into their
already
bodies.
aching shoulders.
The sacrifices of these helmets, who risked
once
their lives
symbols
to
of
contain
courage,
the disaster,
now felt like
are a
leaden
central
weights
and tragic
chained to
part
their
of the
bodies.
Chernobyl narrative.
The distance was over
The
26
sarcophagus,
miles,
a massive
grueling
structure
trek
of
for
concrete,
any able-bodied
steel,
man,
and
but an
lead,
almost
was built
impossible
around the
undertaking
destroyed
for an
reactor,
army that had
a
just
hasty
spent
but
hours
necessary
in a
attempt to
life-or-death
seal
struggle.
off the source
As
of
they
the
began their
radioactive
relentless
fallout.
pace,
The sun
the
climbed
structure
higher,
was built with a
beating
series
down
of
on the
massive,
dust-choked roads.
interconnected concrete
Each step
panels
was a
and
testament
steel
to their
beams,
unwavering
a feat of
will,
engineering
a
that was
physical
performed in a
manifestation
matter
of
of
their
months,
commitment,
a
to their
testament to
city.
the Soviet
The
Union's
collective
immense
rhythm of their
industrial
footsteps was a
capacity
silent
and its
prayer,
desperate
a
need
rhythmic
to contain the
pounding that was the
disaster.
only sound
The
besides the
sarcophagus
wind
was
in
a
their
symbol
ears
of both
and the
hope
ragged
and
breathing
despair,
of their
a
comrades.
testament to
For a
humanity's
moment,
capacity
the narrative
for
of this
ingenuity
incredible
in the face of
journey
a catastrophe,
is interwoven
but also
with
a
one of the
stark
most
reminder of the
enduring
immense,
legends of antiquity.
long-lasting
Though this
consequences
information
of a
has
single
not been
mistake.
verified, and
However,
the account is
the
not found in
sarcophagus
the
was,
earliest
by its
historical
very
records,
nature,
it
a
is said that
temporary
a single
solution.
herald,
A
built
runner
in a
named
rush and in a
Dipict
lethal
was sent from the
environment,
battlefield
it was
to announce
structurally
the victory
unsound
and
and was
warn the
never
city
meant
of
to
the
be a
approaching
permanent
fleet.
solution. He ran the
Its
entire
roof was
distance
full of
without
holes
stopping.
and cracks,
His final words
and the
of
immense
Nike,
weight of the structure,
victory,
combined with the
before
intense
collapsing
radiation
and dying from
caused
his
it to
efforts.
slowly
This
deteriorate over
poignant
the
tale,
years.
whether fact or fiction,
The sarcophagus
has come
was
to
a
symbolize
constant
the
source of
spirit
concern
the
for
event,
engineers and
encapsulating the
who
immense
feared that a
sacrifice
collapse could
and the
lead to a
desperate
new,
race that
catastrophic
defined the
release
aftermath
of
the
radioactive dust.
The
and
historical
debris.
reality was
It was a
perhaps
tomb that was
even more
slowly
profound,
crumbling,
for
a
it was
ticking
not
time
one
bomb
man
that was
but
a
an
constant
entire army
reminder
that
of the
undertook
disaster.
this impossible
The
journey.
impending
Collapse
collapse
of
of
the
the
sarcophagus
the populace
led
was
to
in
a
a
new
state
and
of
even
frantic
more
anxiety.
ambitious project.
News of the Persian
construction
landing at
of the
Marathon
new
had
safe
reached them,
confinement,
but the
in
outcome
SC,
of the battle
a
was
massive,
unknown.
arch-shaped
A sense of
steel
dread
structure
hung
designed to
over
be
the
a
city.
permanent, would their
long-term
army be
solution.
victorious?
The
Would they
NSC
suffer the
was a
same
marvel
fate as
of
modern
Eritrea.
engineering?
Its people
A structure
enslaved
that was built
and its
on
temples
rails
burned.
away from the
There were
reactor
also
and
internal
then slid into
factions to
place
contend
over
with.
the sarcophagus.
Some of the city's
a
aristocratic
complex and
elite were
precise
secretly
operation
sympathetic
that was
to the
performed with the
Persians,
help of
seeing an
international teams
opportunity
of
to
engineers
overthrow
and
the
scientists.
fledgling democracy
The
and restore their
NSC
old
was
power.
a permanent,
The signal from the
long-term
hills that
solution,
Miltiades
a
had
testament
seen
to
was,
humanity's
in fact,
capacity for
a prearranged
ingenuity
sign from
and its
one of these
commitment
factions,
to containing
a
the
message
legacy
to the Persians
of
that
the
the
disaster.
city was now vulnerable
The sarcophagus,
and the time was
a
right
temporary
to strike.
tomb for a
This
permanent
added a layer
disaster,
of betrayal
stands as a
and
powerful
political
and
intrigue
chilling
to the
testament
existential
to the
threat they
immediate,
faced.
desperate response
The
to the
citizens,
Chernobyl catastrophe.
particularly the old men,
It was a
women,
monument to
and
human
children
sacrifice,
who remained in the city,
a symbol of a
could only
nation's
wait
desperate
and pray,
attempt to contain
their
its
eyes
own
fixed
mess,
on the horizon,
and a constant,
desperate for a
crumbling
sign of their
reminder
army's
of the
return.
long-lasting
The Persian
consequences
fleet,
of a
confident
single
and
sailing
catastrophic
with the
mistake,
wind, approached the
The
Attic
story
coast.
of the sarcophagus
They believed the
is
plan
a
was
final
flawless
and most
The
profound
Athenian army would
act
be
of the
either
Chernobyl
defeated
narrative,
or
a
exhausted at
testament to a
Marathon,
world that was
leaving the
violently
city
defenseless.
and irrevocably
They would
changed
sail into
by
the
a
harbor,
single event,
seize control,
its crumbling
force the
facade will
Athenians to
forever
surrender
stand
without
as a
another
monument
battle.
to a disaster.
But as their
that was
ships
both the
rounded the
triumph
final
of human
cape
courage
and the harbor
and a
of
tragic
Fallar
failure
came
of human
view,
judgment,
the Persian commanders saw a sight that
in the
must
hours
have
and
drained
days
the blood
following
from
the
their
Chernobyl
faces.
disaster,
Arrayed on
as
the
the
hills
destroyed
overlooking
reactor
the city,
core spewed
their
a
bronze
continuous,
shields catching
toxic
the
plume
afternoon
of
sun
radioactive
was the
particles into
Athenian
the
army.
atmosphere.
The same
A
men they had
silent,
fought
an
and
invisible
fled from
cloud
just
of
hours
poison
earlier,
began its
now
slow,
standing in a fresh
inexorable
defensive
journey
line,
across the globe,
ready for battle.
Carried on the
Miltiades
wind,
had won the
this
race.
lethal fallout,
The hoplites
a
had
mix
arrived
of deadly
just in time.
isotopes like iodine,
Seeing their window of
131
opportunity slammed
cesium,
shut,
the Persian
137
commanders,
and
their
strontium,
strategic surprise
90,
lost,
drifted
made
across
a
the
final,
Soviet
decisive
Union,
choice.
and then,
they
in
turned
a
their fleet
terrifying
around
and
sailed for
unprecedented
home.
event.
The threat was
Across
over.
Europe and the northern
city was
hemisphere,
safe. In one of the most
contaminating land,
stunning reversals
water,
of fortune
and air,
and military
and leaving
history,
a trail of sickness
small,
and fear
weary
in its
citizen
wake.
army had not only
Chernobyl disaster was not just a local force on the battlefield. It was a global event, a near permanent reminder that in an interconnected world, a single mistake can have a profound and lasting impact. It was a victory not just of arms, the initial, but of most immediate ingenuity. Global impact of the disaster was the profound and terrifying silence from the Soviet authorities. The plains of Marathon and the hills above Athens had witnessed to control the narrative, a testament to the power of the Soviet Union initially downplayed the severity of the disaster. The silence that fell over information about the explosion retreat or the radioactive fallout. but of profound.
It was not until 2 days after the
relief.
disaster,
The
when a
city,
Swedish
which had
nuclear
stood on
power
the precipice
plant,
of
1,000
annihilation,
kilometers
was
from
now
Chernobyl,
safe,
detected
its future
unusually
secured
high
by the
levels of
unimaginable
radiation
bravery
in the air
of its citizens.
that the world became
The army,
aware of the
having made its
catastrophe.
desperate,
The
triumphant
Soviet
march
Union
back
was
from
forced to
Marathon,
admit that
was
there
met
had been
with
a
a
nuclear
populace
accident,
that was awestruck
but even
and
then,
jubilant.
the true
Their
scale
fear
of the
now
disaster
replaced
was
by an
deliberately
immense,
obscured.
surging pride.
A profound
The
and
victory
tragic
was a
example
staggering
of a
testament to the
systemic
power
failure
of
of
the
unified
transparency
people
and
but
accountability.
its immediate aftermath
As the
was a
truth
solemn
slowly
affair.
began to emerge,
The first task
the
was to honor
radioactive
the dead.
cloud
The
continued its journey
192
across the
Athenians
globe,
and
with
11
its trajectory
platoons who had
and
fallen on the
intensity
plane,
determined
instead
by
of
the
bringing
winds
their
of the
bodies
wind
back to the
and
city
weather
for
patterns.
burial. A unique,
Large
and
areas
lasting
of
monument
Belarus,
was erected
Russia,
on the
and
battlefield
Ukraine,
itself. The country's
a great
closest
burial
to the
mound,
disaster,
known as the
were
Soros,
heavily contaminated,
was raised over
with
the
millions of
remains
people living
of
in
the Athenian
areas
fallen.
with dangerously high
This
levels
was an
of radiation.
unprecedented act,
But
for
it was
fallout
customary
did not
to
stop
bury
at
the
the
dead of
Soviet
such a
border.
battle in a public
It drifted
cemetery
across
in the city.
Scandinavia,
By burying
Eastern
them
Europe,
on the battlefield,
and Western Europe,
the Athenians
contaminating
transformed
forests,
the site
farms,
into a perpetual
water
memorial.
supplies.
A sacred
The
ground
radioactive
that would
particles
forever bear
settling on the
witness to
ground
their sacrifice
were absorbed by
the
plants
men who
and
lay
animals,
beneath that mound
entering
were
the
not
food chain
kings and
or
contaminating
aristocrats,
everything
but
from
ordinary
milk
citizens,
and meat to vegetables,
farmers,
and wild
potters,
berries, and merchants.
The people
who
of
had
Europe,
died to protect
living
their
hundreds of
newfound
kilometers
freedom.
from the
This
disaster,
monument was
were
a physical
unknowingly
embodiment
exposed
of the
to a
democratic
silent,
ideal they had
lethal
fought
poison,
for,
a tribute
profound
to the
and
collective
terrifying
valor
reminder
of the
not the
interconnectedness
individual
of our
glory
world.
of the few.
The
The
health
delayed
consequences
arrival
of
of
the
the global
Spartan
fallout
army,
were
a
immense
day late for
and
the battle,
long-lasting, served as a stark reminder
the
of the
immediate
unique
aftermath,
nature of the
the
Athenian
short-lived
victory.
isotope
When the
iodine,
Spartans, a force renowned throughout
which was
Greece for their
released in
martial
massive
prowess,
quantities,
finally
was a particular
arrived at
concern.
Marathon and beheld
Children,
the thousands
who were
of Persian
particularly
bodies
susceptible
strewn
to
across the
radiation,
plain. They could
absorbed
only
the
stare
isotope
into
into
their
disbelief.
thyroid glands.
They offered
leading
their
to a dramatic
congratulations,
increase
but
in
the moment
number
was
of
one of
thyroid
quiet,
cancers in
almost
the years
poignant.
that followed. Independence
In
for
the long
Athenians.
term,
The
they had
long-lived
not waited for the
isotope
legendary
cesium
Spartan
137.
They had
with a
faced the
half-life
enemy
of 30
alone
years
and prevailed.
became the main
This
source
victory
of
gave
radiation
Athens a
exposure,
newfound
contaminating the
confidence
soil
and a
and
legitimacy
water
that
that
could
could
not
not
be
be
challenged.
It was
The
no
global
longer
fallout
from
from Chernobyl
Chernobyl
led to a profound and
but a proven
long-lasting
force,
public health crisis,
a city-state whose
a crisis
strength
that was
lay
both a
not
consequence
in a
of the
professional
disaster,
army,
but in
and
the
a tragic
resolute
result
will
of the
of its
initial
free
lack of
citizens.
information
The
and
long-term
transparency from the
consequences of
Soviet
this
authorities.
single battle were immense.
The Chernobyl disaster,
rippling
in
outwards
its global
and shaping
fallout,
the course
became
of
a
Western
powerful
history
and
for
enduring
millennia.
symbol
The victory
of
at
the perils of
Marathon
nuclear
did
energy.
more than just preserve a
It
small
led to
Greek
a fundamental
city.
shift
It gave the
in the global
Athenians the courage
conversation
and
about
conviction
nuclear
to
power,
pursue
with
a
many
grander
nations
destiny.
reconsidering
In the
their
years
nuclear
following the
programs,
battle,
and a profound
brilliant and
increase
visionary
in public
statesman
opposition
named
to nuclear energy persuaded the
It also
assembly
led to a
use the
significant
vast
increase
silver
in
revenues
international
from the mines at
cooperation
Lorient
on
to build a
nuclear
massive
safety
fleet
and a
of
new
triremes.
commitment
to transparency
This fleet
and
would become the
accountability
backbone
in the
of
nuclear
Athenian
industry.
power.
A force
The
that would
Chernobyl
prove
disaster,
decisive
in
in
its
its
second
global
and
fallout,
far greater,
was a silent
Persian
and
invasion
terrifying
a decade
warning.
later.
A permanent
Without the
reminder
confidence
that a
and
single
the
mistake
political will
can have
born
a
of
profound
marathon,
and lasting
Athens may
impact
never
on a
have
global
embarked
scale.
on this ambitious
The
naval
silent
project.
cloud of poison,
This fleet
a
not
testament
only
to the
saved
destructive
Greece from the
power of
subsequent
nuclear
Persian
energy,
attack,
will
but also
forever
laid
be
the
the foundation
foundation
for
for
the
the
Athenian naval
empire,
an empire of trade and influence
changed
that
the
would
world
define
forever.
the city's golden age.
In the wake of the
victory
disaster,
also
as
had
a
a profound
silent cloud of
cultural
poison
and drifted
intellectual
across
impact.
the globe.
The
The
sheer
Soviet
audacity
Union
of the
embarked on a
achievement,
desperate,
small city-state
ultimately
defeating
futile
the most
campaign
powerful
of political
empire in the
secrecy
world,
and
instilled
misinformation,
in the
a
Athenians
tragic
a sense of
response that
civic pride
prioritized the
and
preservation of the
limitless
state's
potential.
image.
It was in
over
the
the health and
decades
safety
that followed
of its
Marathon
citizens.
that Athens would
The
experience
aftermath of
an
Chernobyl was
unparalleled
not just a
explosion
story
of
of a nuclear
creativity
catastrophe
and intellectual
It was a
thought.
story of
The
a
great
systemic
tragedians,
failure of a government
Aeschylus
that,
and Sophocles,
in its arrogance,
whose works
and
explored
its fear
the
of
very
showing
nature of
weakness,
justice
chose
and
to
human
hide the
fate,
truth from
flourished.
its own people.
And
The
from the world.
philosophers, Socrates,
This culture
Plato,
of secrecy,
and Aristotle,
a hallmark
would begin
of the
to lay
Soviet
the
system,
foundations of
exacerbated
Western
the
human
human
costs
of the
of
disaster,
scientific inquiry, and left a
This
lasting
extraordinary
legacy of
flowering
distrust
of arts
and
and
profound
ideas,
human
from the
suffering.
construction of the
In
Parthenon
the initial
to the
hours and
establishment
days
of the
following
Lyceum,
the explosion,
was
the
inextricably
Soviet
linked
authorities,
to the spirit
under
of
the direct
freedom
orders
and self-reliance
of Moscow,
forged on the
attempted to
to control the narrative by downplaying the validated the democratic ideal, demonstrating that a government of the people could not only survive more than 36 hours after the explosion. In a crucial delay that exposed the Battle of Marathon became a foundational myth for the West. The people
was
of
the
Pripyat
moment
were told that they were being evacuated for
with
a
its
few
unique
days,
emphasis
a lie
on
that was meant
individual
to prevent
liberty,
panic,
reasoned
but which
debate,
ultimately
and the
became
power
a
of the
cruel
human
and
intellect
permanent deception.
stood firm against
For
the
days,
forces of
a May Day
imperial
parade was
authority
held in
and
Kiev.
despotism.
Just
It was the
100
triumph
kilometers
of a
from
new
the
idea
disaster,
over an
a
old
horrific
one,
display
a testament
of
to
the
the
government's
fact that
disregard
courage
for the
and
health and
conviction
safety
could
of its own
overcome
people.
overwhelming numbers.
The information about the true
The story,
scale of the disaster
told and
was
retold by
deliberately
the great
suppressed,
historian
with doctors
Herodotus
being
and
ordered
other
not to
chroniclers,
mention
became a
radiation
beacon
sickness
of
in their
inspiration,
diagnoses,
a reminder
tragic
that the
attempt to
defense
hide
of
the
freedom
truth
from
is
the
a
very
sacred
people
and
who were
sometimes
suffering from its
miraculous
effects.
cause.
The
Its
human
legacy
cost of
lives
this
on not
political
only in the
secrecy
annals
was
of
immense,
history,
but also in our shared
the men who were
consciousness.
sent to clean up
the
the
very
disaster,
word marathon,
the liquidators,
a name for an
were often
iconic
sent
race
into
of
the most
endurance,
dangerous
is a
areas
direct
with little to
tribute
no
the
proper
event,
protective
a
gear,
perpetual
and with
echo
no
of the
knowledge
final,
of the lethal
desperate march of an army
war.
that saved its city.
The doses
The
of
planes of
radiation
marathon,
they received
with
were
their
often
silent burial
downplayed
mound,
or hidden,
stand as a
tragic
monument
attempt
to
to
save the state's
a day
image at
when
the cost
ordinary
of human
citizens,
lives. Fighting for
many
an
of these
extraordinary
men,
idea,
in their profound
altered the
sacrifice,
trajectory of
paid the
history,
ultimate
and laid the
price,
groundwork
and
for
many
a
more
world
were
that would
left
come
with
to
long-lasting
value liberty,
health problems,
self-determination,
and a profound
above
sense
all
of
else.
betrayal.
The men who fell there
Soviet
did not
system,
just
which had
save their
sent them to
city.
die,
They
later
denied them the medical
an
and
idea that
financial support
continues
they
to
were
resonate
promised,
and
a
inspire.
final and tragic
The world,
act of betrayal.
as it turned,
The
was a
secrecy
relentless
of the Soviet
wheel of
government
change.
also led
The
to a
echoes of
profound
Marathon,
and long-lasting
the fierce
public
bronze
health
crisis,
clang of a fledgling democracy's
the lack of
defense
information about the
slowly
radioactive
faded into the
fallout
past,
meant
that
becoming
millions
a
of people
distant
living
memory
in
as the
contaminated
center of
areas
power
were not
shifted
given the
westward,
proper guidance
where
on how to
Hellenic
protect
thought
themselves.
had once held sway.
The consumption
A
of
new,
contaminated
formidable
food and
force
water
now emerged
particularly
from the
milk
sun-drenched
contaminated
peninsula
with
of
radioactive
Italy.
iodine.
This was the
led to
era
a
of
dramatic
Rome,
increase
an
in the
empire
number
not
of
of citizen
citizen
soldiers
soldiers fighting for their
particularly
homes,
in children,
but of professional
This
legions.
public health
A
crisis,
disciplined,
a direct
unyielding
consequence of
machine
the
of
government's
conquest
secrecy
and administration,
left a lasting
the
legacy
Roman
of
eagle,
fear,
a symbol of their
distrust,
supreme
and profound
authority,
human
had
suffering.
soared across the
The
Mediterranean,
Chernobyl disaster,
its shadow
in its
falling
aftermath
over the
of
ancient
political
lands of
secrecy
Carthage
and human
the
cost,
sophisticated
became a
kingdoms
powerful
of Greece
and enduring
the fertile
symbol
cradle
of
the
Egypt.
failures of the
By
Soviet
the beginning
system.
of the Common Era,
It
Rome
exposed
was
the
the
undisputed
flaws
master
of a government
of the known world
that was built
its
on a
borders
foundation
secured
of
by a
control
vast
and
network of
misinformation.
roads, forts,
The
and
disaster,
an army of physical
unparalleled
manifestation of a deeper,
The Romans
more
believed in
profound
their
failure
destiny,
of judgment
their Pax
and oversight.
Romana,
Was a
period of
powerful
peace
and
and
undeniable
order that they were
blow
convinced
to the
was a
Soviet
gift to
Union's
all
claim of
peoples they
technological
subdued.
superiority.
Their ambition
and its
was
moral
insatiable.
authority. Their legions
It was a
testament
wound that,
to a
in
belief
many
in their
ways,
own
accelerated
inevitable
the
and
eventual
rightful
collapse of the Soviet
Yet,
Union.
as the Roman Empire
The
looked
aftermath
to the
of
north,
Chernobyl,
beyond
a
the
story
mighty
of
river
political
known as the
secrecy
Rhine,
and human
they
cost,
encountered a
is a
world
final
that was as
and most
alien to
profound
them as the
act
plains
of
of
the
Chernobyl
Chernobyl
had
narrative.
been to the Persians.
It is a
Testament
testament
to the
Germania,
immense
a
power
land
of
of
a
deep,
disaster to
primordial
expose the
forests
lies
and the
misshrouded
flaws of the
valleys,
system.
and a people as
The human
untamed
cost
as the
of
wilderness
Chernobyl,
they
a
inhabited.
profound and
The Germanic
tragic
tribes were a
consequence of a
collection of
systemic failure,
disparate,
will forever
fiercely
be a part of the
independent
global
clans and
narrative,
peoples,
a silent,
bound by a common
powerful
language
reminder that
and
in
a
a
shared
world of
cultural
immense
heritage
power,
of valor,
transparency,
and
unlike the
accountability
Greeks and
are not
Romans,
just
they
political
had no
choices,
great
but
cities
moral
of
imperatives.
stones.
No complex political
aftermath of
institutions,
Chernobyl stands
and no
as a
written
permanent
laws in the
monument
Roman
to a
sense.
world that was
Their
violently
society was
and
tribal,
irrevocably changed
decentralized,
by a single
and
mistake.
deeply rooted in
Stopwatch
a warrior
equals
ethos.
one.
The Chernobyl
For
disaster,
decades,
the Romans had
catastrophe
sought
of
to subjugate
unprecedented
this rugged
scale
land,
and global reach,
pushing their legions
prompted a
across
slow
the Rhine
but
in a
ultimately
series of
profound
brutal, international
often
response,
inconclusive
a testament to the
campaigns.
fact that in the face
forests
of a
were a
shared,
constant,
invisible
unforgiving
threat,
enemy.
humanity
A
can,
labyrinthine
and
maze
must
where
come
Roman
together.
discipline and
The
formations
initial
were of
silence
little
and
use.
denial from
The
the
Germans
Soviet
fought
Union,
not in
while a
organized
source of
ranks,
immense
but in a
frustration
fluid
and
chaotic style
eventually
of
gave
guerrilla
way
warfare,
to a new era
ambushing
of
legions from the
international
shadows
cooperation
and
on
melting
nuclear
back into the
safety
trees
and a
as
collective
swiftly
recognition
as they had
that a
appeared.
nuclear disaster,
This was a war
in a
of
world
attrition,
of interconnected
and for a long
borders
time,
and global
the
weather
Rhine River
patterns
had remained
is a
the
shared
definitive,
responsibility.
if porous,
The
boundary
Chernobyl
of the
disaster,
empire.
in its
Into this
international
tense
response,
and volatile
was a
situation
powerful
came
and enduring
Publius
symbol of a
Quinctilius
world
Varus,
united,
a man
not
of high
just in
pedigree
fear,
and
but in a
administrative
newfound
experience,
commitment to
appointed
safety
as the
and
governor of the new Roman province of Germania. The initial international
Varus had a reputation
for
for order
confusion
and
and efficiency.
alarm.
A man who
The
had
first
successfully
reports of a
governed
nuclear
Roman
incident
Syria
came not
and
from
brought
the south
wealth
to
to
Rome,
Union, but from Sweden.
However,
where
he was
high
a
levels of
politician,
radiation
not
were
a general of the
detected
highest
at a nuclear
caliber,
power plant,
and he had a dangerous
The
flaw,
world was left to
overconfidence.
piece together the
He
truth
believed
from
that the
fragmented
Romanization of
reports
Germania
and
was a
satellite
foregone
images,
conclusion,
a terrifying
that the
and
tribes were
frustrating
docile
process
and
that
ready to
highlighted the
accept the
dangers
Roman
of a
way
way
of
of
life.
life. Without
He set about
transparency
imposing
and a system
Roman law
built
on
a
taxes
foundation
with a
of
heavy
secrecy.
hand.
Alienating
However,
the very
as the
people
truth
he
slowly
was
began
meant
to
be
emerge,
pacifying.
the international
blind to the
community,
deep-seated
led by
resentment
organizations like
brewing
the
beneath the
International
surface,
Atomic Energy
a
Agency,
resentment that was
IEA,
about to be
began to
weaponized by
mobilize
one
a
of their
response.
His name was Arminius.
The first step was to
and he was
provide
perhaps the
assistance
most
to the Soviet
extraordinary
Union,
figure to
a nation
emerge
that was
from this
woefully
conflict.
unprepared
Born
to
a
deal with the
chieftain's son
disaster
from the
of this scale.
Charusai tribe. He had been sent
International
to Rome as a
teams of
hostage in his
experts,
youth,
including
there,
scientists,
he had been educated
engineers,
in the Roman
and
manner,
doctors,
had
were
learned
sent
Latin,
to Chernobyl to
and had even
assist
served in the
cleanup
Roman army
and to provide
as an
medical
auxiliary
assistance
commander,
to the victims
earning
of
Roman
radiation
citizenship
exposure.
and the rank of knight.
These men and women,
He was a man who
many
moved
of whom were from
effortlessly
nations
between
that were
both
ideological
worlds.
rivals
A son of
the Soviet
Germania
Union,
who had mastered the Roman
tirelessly
tongue,
and selflessly,
Roman tactics,
a powerful
and Roman
and
arrogance.
inspiring example
He was an insider
of a
with an
world
outsider's
united in a
heart,
common cause.
a man who had witnessed the
They
power
provided
and the
crucial
hubris
medical
of the empire
assistance
up
to the
close.
liquidators
As
and the
Varus's
victims of
trusted
the fallout.
advisor,
And they
he was
provided
privy to the
invaluable
governor's
guidance on
plans
how to
and his
contain the
overconfidence.
disaster and mitigate
It was
its
in this
spread.
unique position
The international
that he began
community
to
also
meticulously
responded
plan
by
the most
providing
devastating
financial and
betrayal
technical
in
assistance
Roman
for the
military
long-term
history.
cleanup of the
Arminius's
disaster.
genius lay not
The
just in his
construction of the new
understanding
safe
of Roman
confinement,
tactics,
but in his ability to do
a
what
massive
no other German
arch-shaped
chieftain
steel
had
structure
done
designed
before,
to entomb the
unite
destroyed
the
reactor
disparate
for the
tribes.
next 100
He
years.
secretly
was
met
a
with the
multinational
leaders of the
effort,
Charusai,
a project that was
the
funded
and the
by
Chatti,
dozens of
allying
nations
with a common
and built
cause
by a team
to drive
of
the
international
Romans from their
engineers
sacred
and
lands
scientists.
forever.
He
The
patiently
NSC,
and methodically
a marvel of
convinced
modern
them
engineering,
that a direct,
stands as a
powerful
powerful and
and
enduring symbol of a world
the only way
united
to
in its
defeat the
commitment
mighty
to
legions
containing
was to
the
lure them
legacy
into
of
the
the
one
disaster
place where
and
their
ensuring
discipline
that a similar
and superior
catastrophe
numbers would
will
become
never
a
happen
weakness.
again.
The
Chernobyl
dark
disaster
heart of the
also led
Teutoburg
to a
forest.
profound
The
and
trap was
long-lasting
set with the
shift
precision
in the global
of a master
conversation
hunter.
about nuclear
Arminius,
safety.
feigning loyalty,
It led to the creation
sent word
of
to
new
Varus
international
of a fictional
agreements and
rebellion
protocols
in a
on
distant
nuclear
part of
safety,
Germania,
a new
urging the
commitment
governor
to
to take his
transparency
3
and
legions
accountability
and march
and
there
a
to
new
quell
culture
it.
of safety
Varus,
in the nuclear
never
industry.
doubting his trusted advisor,
The
took
disaster
bait.
was a powerful
He set out on a
and
long
undeniable
march with the
blow
17th,
to the credibility of the
18th,
nuclear
and
industry,
19th legions,
but it also led to a new
nearly
era
20,000
of cooperation
men,
and
along
a
with
new
their
commitment
cavalry
to
and a
ensuring that
massive
the power
baggage
of the
train.
atom is
It was an
used
arduous
safely
journey,
and responsibly.
made even more challenging
The
by
international
the late autumn
response to the
weather and
Chernobyl
the
disaster
unfamiliar,
was a testament to the
treacherous terrain.
fact that in the
They had to
face of
cut
a shared,
new paths
invisible
through the dense
threat,
forest.
humanity
Their disciplined
can
marching
and
columns
must
stretched
come
thin,
together,
their flanks
It was a
exposed.
story of a world united
Varus,
not
despite
just in
receiving
fear,
warnings
but
from
in
another
a
loyal
newfound
Germanic
commitment
chieftain
to safety
about
and
Arminius's plot,
transparency.
dismissed
The
them out of
Chernobyl
hand.
disaster,
He was
in
too
its
confident
international
in his
response,
judgment
was
and
in
in
the
the
loyalty
loyalty
of his
Roman
Roman-educated
symbol of a
friend.
world that,
He marched his
in its
legions
collective
deeper
horror,
and deeper
found
into
a
the
new
Teutoburg
and
forest,
profound sense of
long,
purpose.
vulnerable snake
The
of
legacy
men
of
and
Chernobyl
supplies,
is not
oblivious
just
to
in
the
its
fact
destructive
that they were
power,
walking
but in the
straight
new culture
into a
of safety
meticulously
and
planned
transparency
ambush.
that it created.
The trees
a
held their
culture
breath,
that is a
and in the
testament
deep,
to the power
silent
of a world
shadows
united
of the
in a
forest,
common cause.
thousands of warriors,
Break time
united
equals
for the
0.
first time by a
25
singular
S,
purpose,
forward
waited
slash,
with a patient,
the international
deadly
response
resolve.
to the
The
disaster
stage was
stands
set
as a
for a
permanent
cataclysm
and
that would
powerful
echo
monument
through the
to a
ages
world that
and
was
change the
violently
course of
and
European
irrevocably
history
changed
forever.
by a single
The
mistake.
forest, a place of
The
ancient
immediate,
spirits
cataclysmic
and
events
shadows,
of the Chernobyl
became
disaster,
a living tomb.
a story of
the
human
Roman
error
legions,
and
with
heroic
their
discipline,
disciplines,
ordered
were only the
ranks
beginning
and superior
of a long
engineering,
and tragic
were utterly
aftermath,
unsuited
a
for
long
this
shadow
savage,
that would stretch across the
terrain.
decades.
The
leaving a
meticulously
legacy
planned
of profound
ambush
health
had begun.
effects.
The Germanic
Psychological
tribes,
trauma,
united
and a
under the
fundamental
cunning
shift in
leadership
public
of
perception
Arminius,
of nuclear
emerged
energy.
from the dense undergrowth.
The disaster
not
was
as an
not
army,
a single
but as a
event.
thousand
It was a
lethal
permanent
shadows.
wound on the
The
collective
initial
body
attack
and
was a
mind of a
torrent of
generation,
missiles,
javelins, invisible
stones,
poison,
and
that
arrows,
would continue to
raining
claim
down
victims
from all
for
sides.
years to come. A storm of
The
iron
long
and
shadow
wood
of
that
Chernobyl
Chernobyl
is
is
a
a
Roman
chilling
formations.
testament to the
legions,
profound and
stretched for
long-lasting
miles along a
consequences
narrow,
of a
muddy
single
path,
catastrophic
could not
event.
form their signature
The immediate
defensive
health
shield
effects
walls
of the
or
disaster
maneuver their
were
cohorts.
devastating. The thick trees
In
and
the initial
tangled
hours
roots
and
were a
days
constant
following
obstacle,
the explosion,
turning their
the
legendary
first responders
discipline
and
into
plant
a
workers
fatal
who were
liability.
exposed to the
This was
highest
not a
levels
battle
of
of radiation.
tactics.
Developed
It was a
acute
battle of
radiation
survival,
syndrome,
and the Romans
ARS,
were at a crippling
terrifying
disadvantage.
and often fatal condition
Publius
that leads to the
Quintilius
destruction
Varus,
of the
the
body
overconfident
cells
governor,
and tissues.
watched in horror
In the
as
weeks
his
and
ordered
months that
world
followed,
descended into
28 of
chaos.
these men died
The
a
Romans,
slow and
accustomed to
agonizing
fighting
death.
on open
Their
fields
bodies
armies breaking down at a cellular level, found themselves fighting the human cost of the disaster individualistic in its immediate aftermath. Their heavy armor was a profound and tragic reminder against frontal assault of radiation became an unwieldy but the long shadow of Chernobyl would prove to be even more pervasive. The Germanic warriors, lightly in the years that followed, unencumbered, the residents of the most heavily contaminated areas, their knowledge of the landscape, children, began to suffer from a range of radiation-related health problems. They would strike from behind a tree. The most dramatic of these was a massive increase and then vanish in a number of thyroid cancers in children only to reappear moments to the short-lived isotope iodine. The Roman ranks, 131, unable to see their attackers in massive quantities cohesive disaster. were slowly,
the isotope
methodically
absorbed into the thyroid
The first
gland,
day was a scene
led to a
of
dramatic
unmitigated
increase
slaughter.
in the number
Thousands
of
of
thyroid
Roman
cancers,
soldiers fell,
a tragic
their
and
bodies
poignant
becoming
reminder
part
of
of
the
the
profound
floor.
vulnerability of children
The baggage
to
train,
radiation.
along
In the
vulnerable
long term,
line of
the
carts and
long-lived
supplies,
isotope
was a primary
cesium
target.
137,
The loss of their
with
supplies,
a half-life of
food,
30 years,
medical equipment,
became the main
and tools,
source of
further
radiation
demoralized
exposure,
the surviving
contaminating the
legionaries.
soil and water
The
for
incessant
generations
rain
to come.
turned the ground into a
This
treacherous
long-term
mire,
exposure has
making
been
any
linked to a
attempt
range
at
of
a
other
coordinated
health
retreat
problems,
a logistical
including an
nightmare.
increased risk
The
of
Germans,
other forms of
fighting
cancer,
with a zeal born of
cardiovascular disease,
deep-seated desire
and a
for
host of
freedom,
other
showed
radiation-related
no
illnesses.
mercy.
They were not fighting for
The
conquest,
liquidators,
but
the
for the
army of
very
sacrifice
soul
who were
land.
sent to clean
And
up
every
the
fallen
disaster,
Roman was a
have also
testament to
suffered
their
from a
resolve.
range of
Over the next
long-lasting
2
health
days,
problems.
the situation for the Romans went from
reminder of
desperate
their
to
immense
hopeless.
sacrifice.
Varus,
Beyond
realizing
the physical
the
health
depth of the
effects,
betrayal,
the
tried
Chernobyl
to
disaster
organize also
breakout,
left a lasting
desperate
legacy
charge
of
towards the
psychological
open
trauma
ground.
and a
But the forest
profound
held
shift
them
in
in
public
its
perception
inexorable
of
grip.
nuclear energy. The German forces,
The psychological
now fully
trauma
committed
of the
and sensing
disaster,
victory, a result of the
intensified their
forced
attacks.
evacuations,
The Roman
loss
legions,
of homes
once
and
the pride of
communities,
the empire,
and the constant
were now
fear
a
of
broken,
a silent,
terrified
invisible
mob.
poison.
They
Has
were
led
starving,
to a profound
exhausted,
increase in the
and
rates of
hopelessly
depression,
lost.
anxiety,
The cries of the wounded
and post-traumatic
and dying
stress
filled
disorder,
the air,
PTSD,
a grim soundtrack
in the
to the
affected
final,
populations. Agonizing days
The public,
of the campaign,
particularly
the
in
Eagles,
Europe,
the
was
sacred
left with the
standards of the
deep-seated
legions,
fear and
were lost,
distrust of nuclear
a symbol
energy,
of a defeat,
a fear
so
that was a
total
direct
and so
consequence of the
humiliating that it would
secrecy
send
and
misinformation
shockwaves
throughout the
Soviet
Roman world.
authorities.
On the third day, the
With
long
all hope
shadow
gone,
of Chernobyl,
Varus
a
took his
story
own
of
life,
health effects and
falling
public
on his sword
perception,
rather than
is a
facing
final
the humiliation
and most
of
profound
capture.
act
His
of the
act was a
Chernobyl
grim
narrative.
testament to the
It is a
finality of
testament
their
to the
defeat.
immense
With
and
their commander
long-lasting
dead,
consequences
the remaining
of a
Roman
single
resistance
catastrophic
collapsed.
event. The surviving
human
soldiers,
cost of Chernobyl,
scattered and broken,
in its long
were
shadow
hunted
of
down,
health
problems,
slaughtered.
and
The
psychological
Teutoburg
trauma
forest had
will forever be a
swallowed
part
three
of the
Rome's
global
finest
narrative, a
legions whole.
silent, a
Powerful
catastrophic reminder
loss
that in
of
a
nearly
world
20,000
of
men,
power and in
transparency
doing so,
and
had delivered a
accountability
message
are
that the
not
Roman
just
Empire
political
could not
choices,
ignore, but moral
The forest of
imperatives.
Germania were not
The
to be
long
tamed.
shadow of
The
Chernobyl
victory of
stands as a
Arminius was
permanent
not
and
just a
chilling
military
testament to a
triumph.
world that was
It
violently
was a profound
and irrevocably
declaration that the
changed by a
spirit of
single
freedom,
mistake. Even in the face
its
of
legacy of
overwhelming
fear
power
and distrust
could not
will
forever
conquered.
be a part
The
of the
battle
global
marked the
narrative,
definitive
a
end of
silent,
Rome's expansion
powerful reminder
into northern
of a day
Germania,
that changed the
a
world
boundary
forever.
that would remain a line of demarcation
As
for
the years
centuries,
passed,
forever
and the temporary
altering
concrete
the future map
sarcophagus
and
built
cultural
in the
identity
immediate
of Europe.
aftermath of the disaster
The reverberations
began
of
to
the
show its age.
Teutoburg
The world was
disaster
faced with
echoed
a
for
new
centuries,
and daunting
a
challenge.
ghost in the
need
vast
for a
halls of
permanent,
the Roman Empire.
long-term solution
The Rhine
to contain
became a
the
line
destroyed
of
reactor
steel
and
and
memory,
its lethal
a
contents
boundary
for the
that
next
Rome
100
dared
years.
not cross again.
The sarcophagus,
The empire,
a hastily
weakened by
built
internal
tomb,
strife,
was
and
crumbling,
external pressures,
and a collapse could
slowly
lead to a
fractured
new
and eventually
catastrophic
fell
release
in the
of
west,
radioactive
leaving
dust
a void that was
and debris.
filled by a patchwork
The solution,
of emerging, a marvel
often
of modern
warring
engineering
kingdoms.
and a symbol
The
of
Frankish
international
tribes,
cooperation,
once a loose
was the new
confederation
safe
of
warrior
confinement
peoples,
in SC,
had coalesced
a
into
massive,
a powerful
arch-shaped
kingdom in
steel
Gaul,
structure
their
designed to
strength
be a
rooted in a
permanent,
new feudal
long-term
system
shield
and
against
the
the
indomitable
legacy of the
will of their
disaster.
leaders. A new
The
European
NSC
order
is a
was being
testament to
forged
humanity's
in the crucible
capacity
of
for
post-Roman
ingenuity,
chaos,
and its
but its
commitment
destiny
to
was
containing
far
the
from certain.
long-lasting
For while Europe
consequences
was
of
looking
a single
inward,
catastrophic
splintered
event,
and rebuilding,
the
a
NSC
new,
was an
cataclysmic
unprecedented
power was
engineering
rising from the
challenge.
sands of the Arabian
It was a
Peninsula.
massive,
This was the
arch-shaped
Umayyad
steel
Caliphate,
structure,
over
a force of
100 meters
unparalleled
high
speed
and 250
and
meters
fervor.
wide. Designed
In
to
a
be
mere
built
100
on
years
rails
since the
away
death
from
of
the
the
reactor,
Prophet Muhammad,
and then slid
their
into
armies,
place over the
driven by the
sarcophagus,
zeal of a
a
new
complex
faith,
and precise
swept
operation
across the
that
Middle
was
East,
performed with the help
swallowed
of
the
international
Sasanian
Persian
Persian
engineers
empire
and
whole,
scientists,
and
thundered across
the
North
structure was
Africa
built
to the
with a
shores of the
double-layered
Atlantic.
steel skin.
The conquest was
series of
more than a
massive,
military
interconnected
campaign.
steel beams,
It was a spiritual
and a sophisticated
revolution,
ventilation
a testament
system
to
to
control the
unifying
spread of
power of
radioactive
Islam.
dust from North
and debris.
Africa. The Umayyad
The
forces,
NSC was a
now a
marvel of
multi-ethnic
modern
tapestry of
engineering.
Arabs,
A structure that
Berbers,
was built
and
to
others,
last for the next
crossed the
100
Strait of
years,
Gibraltar,
a
and
testament
rapidly
to
conquered
humanity's
the
commitment
Visigothic
to
kingdom of
containing the
Iberia,
legacy
an
of the
entire
disaster.
peninsula falling.
The
in
construction
less than
of the
a
NSC was
The
a
Pyrenees
monumental
Mountains,
and
once thought to be a
unprecedented
natural
engineering
and
challenge,
impregnable
performed
barrier,
in a
were
lethal
now the
environment
final
of
frontier.
intense
The
radiation.
man who would stand against this relentless
fell to
tide
a
was
team
a
of
figure
international
of immense political
engineers
and military
scientists
prowess,
who worked in shifts,
a leader who held
with
the Frankish
each
kingdom
given
together
a few minutes
despite
to work
not being
before being
himself.
rotated out to limit
His
their
name was
radiation
Charles
exposure.
Martel.
The hammer
The work
of
was
the
performed
Franks,
under
a title he
immense
would
pressure
earn in the crucible
with
of
constant,
battle.
terrifying
Charles was a
knowledge
man of
that
action
every
and
passing
strategic
moment was a
foresight,
dose of
a
radiation
major
being
domus or
absorbed
mayor
into
of
their
the
bodies.
palace,
Who ruled
the
in
sacrifices
all
of
but
these men,
He had spent
who risked
years
their lives to
consolidating
contain
his
the
power,
disaster,
building a
are a
professional
central
army,
and tragic
and
part of the
subduing his
Chernobyl
internal
narrative.
rivals.
He was a master of his
was
craft,
a permanent,
but he now faced
long-term
a challenge
solution,
of a different
a
magnitude,
testament to humanity's
a force that had
capacity
known
for
nothing but
ingenuity
victory for
and
a
its
century.
commitment to
The
containing
Umayyad
the
legacy
legacy of
under the
disaster.
command of Abd
The
al-Rahman
NSC was designed to
a
not
seasoned
only
and brilliant
general
destroyed
had
reactor
crossed
and
the
its lethal
Pyrenees
contents,
and were raiding
but also
deep
to
into
allow
southern
for the
Gaul.
future
They
dismantling
sacked
of
the
the
city of
reactor
Narbonne
and the safe disposal
port,
of its
and
radioactive
then moved
waste.
inland, capturing
The
and
structure
plundering
was a
city after
symbol
city.
of both
The
hope
city
and
of Bordeaux
despair,
fell
a
after a
testament to
ferocious
humanity's
battle,
capacity
the
for
population
ingenuity
slaughtered
in the
and
face
its
of
rich
catastrophe.
catastrophe.
But
The
also a
Visigothic
stark
Duke
reminder
of
of the
Aquitaine,
immense,
who had tried to
long-lasting
resist them,
consequences
was
of
utterly
a single
defeated.
mistake.
His army
The
shattered.
NSC is a
The
permanent,
path to the heart of the
long-term
Frankish
solution,
kingdom
a
now
testament
seemed
to a
open
world
and
that,
inviting.
in its collective
Abd
horror,
al-Rahman's
found
ultimate
a new
objective
and
was not
profound
just
sense of
conquest,
purpose,
but a grand
the new
plundering
safe
raid,
confinement,
and the city
a permanent
of Tours,
shield against
with
a
its
permanent
wealthy
disaster,
and sacred
stands
basilica
as a
of St.
powerful
Martin,
and
was a
enduring
prize
symbol
of
of the
unimaginable
international
riches.
response to
Charles
the Chernobyl
Martel,
catastrophe.
recognizing the
It was a
existential
monument
threat,
to
did
human
not rush to
ingenuity,
meet the
a
invaders
symbol
in
of
the
a
open
world
field,
united
a
in its
move that would have
commitment
been
to
suicidal
containing the
against
legacy
the
of the
fast,
disaster,
highly
and a
mobile
constant,
Umayyad cavalry.
powerful reminder
Instead,
of the long-lasting
he made a strategic
consequences
decision
of a
that would
single
define the
catastrophic
battle. He
mistake.
chose his ground with meticulous
The story
care,
of the NSC
selecting a
is a
position
final
between the
and
cities
most
of Tours
profound
and Poitiers.
act of the Chernobyl
The terrain
narrative,
was a subtle
a
but
testament to a
decisive
world
ally,
that was violently
a wooded,
and
elevated
irrevocably
plateau that
changed
would
by a
neutralize
single
the
event.
Umayyad cavalry's
Its gleaming
speed and
facade
charge,
will forever
forcing
stand
them to
as a
fight
monument
on its
to a
terms.
disaster that
This
was both a
position also
triumph
provided
of
an
human
advantage for
and
the
a tragic
Frankish
failure
infantry
of
who
human
could
judgment.
fight in a dense,
The
defensive
NSC,
formation,
a permanent shield
Charles
against
spent
a permanent
months
disaster,
gathering his forces,
is a final,
a coalition
and
of
most
Frankish
enduring
warriors,
monument to a
Austrasian
world that
veterans,
was violently
and other Germanic
and
allies who were
irrevocably
united by a common
The
fear
Chernobyl
and a growing
disaster,
sense
a
of a shared
catastrophe of
Christian identity.
unprecedented
The
scale
stage was
and
set
global
for a
reach,
cataclysmic
has left a
clash of
profound
civilizations.
and lasting
On
legacy.
one side
A
stood
final
the
warning
Umayyad
that
army,
continues
a
to shape
professional,
our understanding of
well-equipped
nuclear
force of
energy
Arab and
safety,
Berber cavalry,
and the delicate
their
balance
lances and
between
scimitars
progress
honed
and
by
peril.
100 years of
The disaster
unbroken
was not
victories.
just a
On the
single
other
event.
side stood
It was
the
a
Frankish
permanent
army,
wound on the
a mix
collective
of seasoned
body and
veterans
mind of a
and
generation,
newly levied
a
foot
silent,
soldiers,
invisible
their strength
poison
lying
that
not
would
in
continue
speed,
to claim
but in the sheer
victims for
weight
years
and
to come.
discipline of their armored
The
infantry.
Chernobyl legacy
For a
is a
full
chilling
week,
testament
the
to
two
the
massive
profound
armies
and
faced each
long-lasting
other,
consequences
separated
of
by
a
the
single
cold
catastrophic
October air.
event.
A
Permanent
silence
reminder
punctuated
that
by
with
the
the
rattling
awesome
of
power
armor
of
and the
nuclear
neighing
energy
of
comes an
horses.
equally
Abd
awesome
al-Rahman was
responsibility
hesitant
to
attack,
manage it with
for he
humility,
sensed a trap,
honesty,
while Charles
and an
waited
unwavering
patiently,
commitment,
confident
to
in his
safety.
position.
The
The
Chernobyl
Umayyad
disaster
general was
fundamentally
forced to make a
altered
difficult
the global
choice
conversation about
to attack
nuclear
the
energy.
formidable Frankish wall of
It led
shields
to a
or risk
profound
being
and long-lasting
outflanked
shift
and
in
outmaneuvered.
public perception.
The long,
with many
silent
nations
standoff
reconsidering
was a
their
testament
nuclear
to the
programs
tactical
and a
brilliance of
dramatic
both
increase in
commanders,
public
a
opposition
pause that
to nuclear
belied the
energy.
immense violence
The
that
disaster
was
was a
about to unfold.
powerful and
The fate of
undeniable
Christian
blow to the
its
credibility
culture
of the
and its
nuclear
political
industry.
landscape,
But it
all
also
held
led
in
to
a
a new
single,
era
delicate
of international
balance,
cooperation
a balance that
on
was
nuclear
about to be
safety
broken by the
and a new
force of a
commitment to
single
transparency
the
and
long,
accountability.
silent standoff
The disaster
between the
was
two
a
vast
final
armies
and
was a
powerful
testament to
warning,
the tactical
a permanent
genius
reminder
of both
that the
commanders.
power of the
A
atom,
week-long
while a
staring
source of
contest
immense
that
energy,
belied the
is
immense
also a
violence
source
to
of
come.
immense danger.
The Umayyad forces,
The legacy of
unaccustomed
Chernobyl
to
is
such
also
a
in the
stalemate,
profound
began
health
to grow
effects
restless.
that it left behind.
Their cavalry impatient
long
for the
shadow
glory
of
and
Chernobyl,
plunder they had
a
come
story
to
of
expect.
health problems
On a
and
fateful
psychological
Saturday in
trauma
October
will
732,
forever be a part of the global
long-awaited
narrative.
The order was given.
The disaster
and the
led to a
Umayyad
massive
cavalry,
increase
a
in the
fearsome
number
and
of
celebrated
thyroid
force,
cancers in children,
thundered across
and a
the
range
plain
of other
towards the Frankish
radiation-related
line.
illnesses
It was an
in the
attack of
liquidators
unparalleled
and the affected
speed and
populations.
ferocity. A wave
The
of
human
shouting
cost of
men
Chernobyl,
and pounding
in its
hooves,
long
a
shadow
sight
of
that had
health
broken the
problems
morale
and
of
psychological
countless
trauma,
armies before.
will forever
Their
be a
goal
part
was
of the
simple,
global
to
narrative,
smash through
a
the Frankish
silent,
infantry with the
powerful
weight of
reminder
their
that in a
charge
world
and
of
unleash
immense power,
a devastating
transparency
but
and
the Frankish
accountability
forces
are
were
not
ready.
just political
Charles
choices,
Martel, a
but
man
moral
of iron
imperatives.
will and keen
But the
foresight,
legacy of
had
Chernobyl
prepared
is
his
not
army for
just
exactly
its
this
destructive
moment.
power.
It
He
is
had
also
not
in the
positioned them in an
profound human
exposed line but in a dense, defensive formation.
The story of
on
the
a
liquidators,
elevated
an army
plateau.
of sacrifice
The Frankish
who risked their
infantry,
lives
an
to
army
contain
of
the
disciplined
disaster,
men
is a
armed with
testament to the
spears,
immense
shields,
courage and
the fearsome
selflessness
Frankish
of ordinary
acts.
people
The Francisca
in the face of an
formed an
invisible,
impenetrable
lethal threat.
wall of shields. Their
This was a
heroic
new
efforts,
kind of fighting,
often performed
not the light
under coercion of their
and with
Germanic
profound
ancestors,
personal
nor the
sacrifice,
rigid phalanx
prevented
of the
an
ancient
even
Greeks.
greater catastrophe.
This was a brutal,
and provided a
heavy
crucial,
infantry formation,
albeit tragic,
a solid
example of the
unyielding
human
block of
spirit's
men who were
capacity
prepared to
for
stand their
resilience.
ground.
The
As the
liquidators,
Umayyad cavalry,
in their tragic
the hammer of the
sacrifice,
caliphate,
became the
crashed
living
into this
legacy
wall.
of Chernobyl,
They met an anvil
a permanent
of
reminder
unshakable
of the
resolve.
profound
The
perils
sound of the
nuclear
impact was
energy.
immense. A Chernobyl disaster in its legacy clashing is a final and the desperate cries of men and horses. It is a testament to the immense cavalry and long-lasting consequences of a single catastrophic event. The Frankish line. The disaster was a story chosen of a world so deliberately by Charles and irrevocably changed by a single mistake. The trees and uneven ground be a part of the full-scale charge, forcing the horses legacy to slow of Chernobyl and the men to its profound and long-lasting consequences. The Franks is a silent, standing shoulder to shoulder that in a world of immense withstood charge, transparency, and accountability are not just political choices at bay, but moral imperatives. While their axes and swords, the Chernobyl legacy, devastatingly effective against the lighter armor as a permanent and chilling testament to a world that was violent combat and irrevocably the Frankish wall held firm. Its shadow will forever be a part of the global newfound collective identity that transcended their tribal a day that changed the world. They were fighting forever, not just for their leader, but for their catastrophe at Chernobyl, for the sanctity of their engineering failure of monumental proportions. The battle rage gave rise to a new brutal and vital field of scientific inquiry. The necessity of their charges growing more desperate, invisible, less effective, pervasive threat, were unable to find the sheer scale of the radioactive release. A complex mixture of the battle began to turn in a moment of critical strategic confusion. Created an unprecedented Umayyad commander, was killed in the midst of the battle. Though historical accounts differ biological, ecological, and environmental with their leader gone, the Umayyad chain of command broke down. This unforeseen rumor spread through the ranks, silent laboratory of intentionally started tragic proportions that there led to the birth rich of a new train were under attack. A science dedicated to understanding the Umayyad forces between radiation for their love life itself. Began to abandon the Chernobyl disaster in a desperate rush to protect their immense became a crucible for a new kind of organized retreat, one that would shape our understanding of nuclear safety that shattered their military cohesion. Before Charles Martel, much of the world's knowledge about the effects of large-scale nuclear accidents came from limited, unleashed his forces, ethically no longer just a defensive wall, civilian but a hammer of their own. The disaster, pursuing the now disorganized, created a unique and tragic laboratory. The battle turned into a rout. Scientists, doctors, the Frankish and biologists from fighting with a renewed sense of purpose and thirst for revenge, and the surrounding contaminated areas of the fleeing, risking their own health to study the effects of radiation on plants, with historical estimates suggesting that the Umayyad army suffered tens of thousands of casualties, known as radioecology and radiation biology, minimal. Emerged from the necessity of and the outcome was an unquestionable, decisive researchers meticulously documented the next morning of Charles Martel through the food chain, expecting the genetic mutations in local wildlife forces and the long-term health consequences but the plains were silent. Populations. The Umayyad army, the broken and demoralized, a stark and chilling monument to the immediate effects of high-level radiation, with a wisdom that transcended his martial prowess. Study, chose scientists sought to understand the goal was not to annihilate the Umayyad Empire and what it meant for the long-term viability, and that objective had been achieved. The human cost of Tours was a victory that had profound and continues to be lasting consequences. Break time was the definitive end of the Umayyad expansion into Western Europe. The line drawn in studies of the liquidators that would forever the children who developed thyroid and religions of the residents of the most contaminated Charles Martel's power and prestige, albeit tragic, laying the foundation for the Carolingian dynasty and the eventual rise of his grandson. The doctors and scientists who worked with these populations it ensured that Christianity would remain the dominant religion of Western radiation-related forever shaping its political, that were shared with the global spiritual identity. The hammer had tragic knowledge. Gained at the cost of profound human suffering, Europe was forged. Is now a cornerstone of nuclear medicine after the hammer of Charles Martel had stopped the Chernobyl disaster, and the map of Europe continued to shift, forced a new era of transparency and a new commitment to ethical research. The Carolingian dynasty, consequence of the lies and misinformation that had so tragically risen to great heights, initial response. And then, in turn, the study of the exclusion zone giving birth provided a wealth of knowledge on how nature responds to a profound shrouded isles to the north. A new civilization, a strange and paradoxical landscape, a land of rolling green hills, but an ancient stone contaminated ecosystem had been a battleground for centuries. Became a unique laboratory for biologists. Anglo-Saxons they studied how a wide variety of species and Viking raiders had terrorized wild and then settled the land and birds, creating a rich adapted to a highly radioactive environment. By the 11th
While
century,
the studies confirmed
England
that
was
the
a
animals were
relatively
living with
stable
high
kingdom,
levels of
but its peace
radiation
was
and showed
precarious,
signs of
and
genetic
its future
mutations,
was about to be
they also
decided on a
revealed a
single,
surprising
bloody
resilience
day.
and
The
adaptability
year
of nature,
1066
a
was a
strange
year of
and paradoxical
destiny, a
testament
pivotal moment
to a world
in the history
that was
of England
violently
that began
and
with the death
irrevocably
of
changed.
King Edward the Confessor.
The Chernobyl
A pious
disaster
and
and its
childless
unforeseen
monarch,
fallout
Edward's death
forced
in
humanity
January
to
of that
confront
year
the
left a
profound
dangerous
and
vacuum,
long-lasting
a
consequences
throne
of
without
its
a
actions.
clear,
And in
direct
doing
heir.
so,
His
it gave
passing
rise
plunged
to
the
a
kingdom
new
into a
vital
crisis
science.
of succession.
The new
An
science
open invitation
born from
for ambitious
tragedy
claimants
is a
from
testament
across
to
the
the
European
fact that
continent.
even in the darkest
This was
of
not a
moments,
contest of a few
humanity's
nobles,
quest for
but a
knowledge
clash of
and
three powerful
understanding
men,
can shine through.
each with a legitimate
The
claim
unseen
and the
fallout,
military
a
strength
silent
to enforce
and
it.
lethal
The
reminder
first
of the
and most
disaster
immediate
became a
contender was
powerful
Harold
and
Godwin's
enduring
son,
laboratory
an
for a new
Anglo-Saxon
generation
of
of
immense
scientists,
power and wealth,
a final,
a man
and
who
most
had been
profound,
Edward's most
trusted
trusted
advisor
advisor and brother-in-law.
In its immense
Harold
tragedy,
was chosen
has
as
left
king
a
by the
lasting
Witan,
legacy of
the
courage,
Council of Anglo-Saxon
resilience,
elders
and a
and
newfound
nobles,
commitment
a traditional
to a
and
safer,
legitimate
more
means of selecting a
transparent
monarch.
He was
The
a capable
Chernobyl
leader,
disaster,
a
in its
battle-hardened
unforeseen
warrior,
fallout,
and a man
stands
who
as a
represented
permanent
the
and chilling
established
testament to a
Anglo-Saxon
world
order.
that was violently
His claim
and
was based on the will of
changed
the
by a
people
single
and the
mistake.
council of the kingdom.
He
Its
was,
lessons,
to many,
learned at
the
an
rightful
immense
king.
cost. The
Will
second
forever
claimant
be a part
and
of
the
the
most
global
dangerous
narrative
was William,
silent,
the Duke of
powerful
Normandy,
reminder of
a
a day that
descendant of
changed
Viking
the
raiders
world
who had
forever.
settled in northern France.
In a final,
William
and
was
most
a man
profound,
of great ambition,
active its evolving
ruthlessness,
narrative,
the
and
Chernobyl
military
exclusion
genius.
zone.
His claim
Once
to
a
the English
terrifying
throne
and
was based on
desolate
two
death
promises,
zone,
shrouded
a verbal
in
pledge that
secrecy,
he insisted
has
King
undergone
Edward
a bizarre
had made to him
and
years
paradoxical
before,
transformation,
and an oath that he claimed
becoming an
Harold
unlikely
Godwin's son
tourist
himself had
destination,
sworn to him.
and a source
This
of
oath,
morbid
allegedly
fascination
made
for
while
thousands
Harold
of
was
visitors
shipwrecked in
each
Normandy,
year.
was said to be
This
a promise
shift
to support
from a symbol of
William's
a man-made
claim
hell
to
to
a
a
unique
William saw
historical
Harold's
and
coronation
ecological
as a
site,
betrayal
is a
and a
testament
personal
to the
insult.
strange and
He began to
complex
gather a
relationship
massive
between
invasion
humanity,
force,
tragedy,
a pan-European
and the
coalition
passage
of
of time.
knights and mercenaries.
They knew
fueled
Chernobyl,
by a papal
a place
blessing
of profound
and the promise of
silence
land
and
plunder.
eerie beauty.
The final
is a
contender was
powerful
Harold
and unsettling
Hardrada, the
reminder
king of Norway,
that even the most
a legendary
catastrophic
Viking
events can be
warrior,
recontextualized,
a man whose
and
reputation for
reinterpreted
battle was
by a new
unmatched.
generation.
Hardrada also
The
laid
genesis
claim
of
to the
Chernobyl
English
tourism.
throne.
His
A phenomenon
phenomenon
based on an
known
old
as
agreement
dark
between a
tourism
former
began
Norwegian
in the late
king and a
1990s
previous
and
English
early
monarch,
2000s,
a tenuous
as the
but
veil
still
of secrecy
recognized
surrounding
promise.
the disaster
Hardrada
began
was
to
not a
lift,
man to
and
let
the
a claim
story
go
of its
unanswered.
human and
in the
ecological
autumn of
costs became
1066,
widely known.
he launched a massive
Visitors,
invasion force,
often guided by
a fleet of
former
hundreds of
liquidators
Viking
or
longships,
plant workers,
aiming
were
to
drawn to
conquer
the
the north of
exclusion
England.
zone by a
The stage was
profound
set
and
for a
morbid
year of
curiosity,
unparalleled
a desire
military
to
drama,
see for themselves
as
the
Harold
ghostly
Godwin's son,
landscapes of
the new
Pripyat,
king of
the
England,
crumbling
was
sarcophagus,
consolidating his rule
and the
in the
chilling
south.
legacy of a
News
nuclear
arrived of a
catastrophe.
massive Viking
The
invasion.
tours, often
Harold
conducted
Hardrada
in a
and his
controlled
forces
and
had
safe
landed
manner
in the
with
north,
strict rules
sailing
on
up the
radiation
Humber
exposure,
River
and
offered
capturing
a
the city
unique
of York.
and powerful glimpse
Harold,
into a
a
world
man
that
of
was
incredible
permanently
speed
altered
and
by a
resolve,
single event.
immediately gathered his
The
army,
experience
and,
of visiting
in an
Chernobyl
astonishing
is a
display
deeply
of military
unsettling
endurance,
and profoundly
marched them the
moving one.
length of the country.
Visitors
Visitors
walked
walked
through
through
the abandoned streets
miles
of
in
Pripyat,
just 4 days.
a time capsule
In a
of
swift
1986,
and brutal encounter,
with Ferris wheels
Harold's
frozen
army
in time,
met the Vikings at the
abandoned
Battle
schools
of
with
Stamford
children's
Bridge.
books and
The
dolls
ensuing
still on
battle
desks,
was a complete
and
and
apartment buildings
decisive
that are
victory
slowly
for the
being
Anglo-Saxons.
reclaimed by nature.
Harold Hardrada
The
was
silence
killed,
is
and
deafening.
the Viking
A
invasion
stark
was
and
crushed.
chilling contrast
the long,
to the vibrant,
bloody age of
bustling
Viking
life that
imperial
once
ambition
existed
in
there.
England was over.
The tours
But
also
the victory
visit the
was a
reactor
hollow one.
itself.
Harold's
Offering a
army was
sobering and
exhausted,
powerful
depleted,
view of the
and
massive
far from
new
the southern
safe
coast.
confinement.
It was in
in
this
SC,
moment of
a
triumph
monument
that the
to humanity's immense
news
and
arrived.
ongoing effort
William
to
of
contain the
Normandy had
disaster.
landed. The Norman fleet had
experience
crossed
is a
the
powerful
English Channel
and unsettling
and established
reminder
a
that the
beachhead
world
near
we
the town of
live in is
Hastings,
fragile,
a move
and that
that
a
placed
single
them in the
mistake
heart
can
of
have
Harold's
profound
kingdom
and
a
lasting
direct
consequences.
and immediate threat to his
Chernobyl
rule.
tourism,
Harold
however,
was faced with
is
a
not
critical
without its
and possible
controversies.
choice. He could wait,
Critics argue
rest
that it
his
is a
men,
form of
and gather fresh
exploitation levies. But in doing so, he would allow William to consolidate his position human and ravage the southern counties. They argue that the Tours could immediately turn his exhausted army around and the profound sacrifice of the forcing a battle before the Normans could fortify into a spectacle. With the same audacious courage that had carried him to victory, argue that they serve a vital educational purpose. The Anglo-Saxon army, Tours provide a powerful and sobering reminder of the dangers of equally punishing march. A living history lesson that is more effective spent their time preparing, forging, and building a wooden castle at their Tours provide a crucial source of income for the local communities. The two ongoing cleanup, one exhausted and driven by economic activity, the other fresh and driven by ambition, disaster, were on a collision course. The transformation of Chernobyl from a death zone, the Anglo-Saxons finally took up a defensive position, a most profound shield wall of its evolving resolve. On the
It is a
plains
testament
below,
to the
the
strange
Norman army,
and complex
a mix
relationship
of disciplined
between
archers,
humanity,
heavy
tragedy,
cavalry,
and
and
the
passage
infantry
of time,
arrayed itself for
they
battle.
knew Chernobyl,
The sun set on
a
that
place of
fateful
profound
October
silence,
evening,
casting
and eerie
long
beauty,
shadows over
is
the
a
two
powerful
camps.
and
The fate
unsettling
of
reminder
England,
that
its
even the
language,
most
its
catastrophic
culture,
events
and its
can be
political future would be
recontextualized
decided in
and
the morning.
reinterpreted by a
The
new
dawn of
generation.
October 14th,
Its transformation is a
1066,
final,
broke
and
over
most
a quiet,
profound,
fog-shrouded
act of a
landscape
narrative that,
on the
in its
high ground
immense
of what would
tragedy,
come to be
has
known
left
as
a
Sinlac
lasting
Hill.
legacy
The
of
Anglo-Saxon
courage,
army of
resilience,
King Harold
and a
Godwin's
newfound
son
commitment
stood in
to a
dense,
safer,
more
more
transparent
transparent
world.
They had marched over
new
200
Chernobyl,
miles
a
in
place
a
of
week,
profound
fought a decisive
silence
battle
and
in the
eerie
north,
beauty,
and then
stands
marched
as a
back
permanent
south.
and
And
chilling
now they were
testament to a
exhausted,
world that was
but their
violently
spirits were not
and
broken.
irrevocably
They were a
changed by a
defensive
single
force,
mistake.
armed with
Its
spears,
evolving legacy
swords,
will forever
and the
be a
formidable
part of the
two-handed
global
Danish
narrative,
axe,
their
silent,
strength lying
powerful
in a
reminder
single,
of a day
formidable
that changed
tactic,
the world
the
forever.
shield wall.
This was a human bulwark,
The Chernobyl
of interlocking
disaster,
shields,
a catastrophe
hedge
of
steel,
unprecedented
and wood that was
scale
designed
and
to be
global reach,
unbreakable,
has left
a
a
defensive
profound
fortress
and
that had
lasting
repelled
legacy.
countless
A
Viking
final
and
warning that
Saxon
continues
foes
to
over the
shape
years.
our understanding
They held the
of
high
nuclear
ground,
energy,
a strategic
safety,
position
and a
that
delicate
forced their
balance
enemy
between
to
progress
attack
and
uphill.
peril.
A disadvantage
The disaster
that
was
Harold
not
hoped
just
would
a
neutralize
single
the
event.
Normans'
It was a
greatest
permanent
strength.
wound on the collective
Below
body
them,
and
on the
mind of a
sloping
generation.
plain, the
A
Norman
silent,
army of William,
invisible poison
Duke of
that
Normandy,
would continue
was
to
arrayed
claim
for
victims
battle.
for years to
Their
come.
forces were a mix
The
of three
Chernobyl
distinct
legacy
elements,
is a chilling
each
testament
with a
to the
specific
profound
purpose.
and long-lasting
In the front were the
consequences
archers, of a single
whose job was to
catastrophic
soften the enemy
a permanent
with a hail of
reminder that with
arrows.
the awesome
Behind them
power
stood
of
the heavy
energy
infantry,
comes an
a
equally
disciplined
awesome
line of
responsibility.
But
To
the
manage
true
it
power
with
of the
humility,
Norman army
honesty,
lay in its heavy
and an
cavalry,
unwavering commitment
knights on
to human
horseback
safety.
armed with lances
The
and
Chernobyl
swords.
disaster
William's
fundamentally
strategy
altered
was
the
simple
global
and
conversation
brutal.
about
To break
nuclear
the
energy.
Anglo-Saxon shield wall
It
with
led
a
to a
combination of
profound
missile
and
fire and
long-lasting
relentless
shift in
assaults,
public
and then
perception,
to exploit
with many
any
nations
weakness with its
reconsidering their
devastating
nuclear
cavalry
programs,
charge.
and a
The
dramatic
clash of
increase
these two
in public
contrasting
opposition to
military
nuclear
styles.
energy. The immovable
The disaster
shield
was
wall
a powerful
versus
and
the irresistible
undeniable
charge
blow to the
would
credibility
determine
of the
fate
nuclear
of a
industry.
nation.
But
The
it
battle
also led
began
to a
with
new
the archers,
era of
a thick
international
cloud of arrows
cooperation on
soared
nuclear
into safety,
sky,
and
a
a new
deadly
commitment
rain that
to
crashed into the
transparency and
Anglo-Saxon
accountability.
shield wall.
The
with a
disaster
dull,
was a
rhythmic
final
thud.
and powerful warning.
But the arrows,
a permanent
shot from the
reminder
low
that the
ground,
power of the
were
atom,
largely
while a
ineffective
source of
against
immense
the tightly
energy,
packed,
is also a
uphill
source of
formation.
immense danger.
The men in the shield wall
The
held
legacy
their
of
ground,
Chernobyl
their
is also
shields
in the
deflecting
profound
the arrows,
human
their
spirit
morale
that it
intact.
revealed. The initial
The story
attack
of
had
the
failed to
liquidators,
achieve its
an
objective.
army of sacrifice
Next,
who
William
risked their
sent his
lives
infantry
to contain the
forward.
disaster.
A line of disciplined soldiers
the
who charged up
courage
the hill.
and
They
selflessness
met a wall of ordinary
spears and
people
axes
in the face
a furious
of an invisible,
bloody melee
lethal
that
threat.
saw the Normans repulsed with
Their
heavy
heroic
losses.
efforts, the shield
often
wall,
performed
despite
under
the
coercion
immense pressure
and with profound
held
personal
firm.
sacrifice.
The Norman cavalry
prevented an
a force
even
that had been
greater
the pride of
catastrophe
William's army
and provided a
now
crucial,
charged,
albeit
but they
tragic,
too were met with a
example
wall
of the
steel,
human spirit's
their horses
capacity for
unable to
resilience.
find purchase on the steep,
The liquidators,
muddy
in
incline.
their tragic
They were
sacrifice,
forced to pull back,
became the
their
living
charge
legacy
broken
of
and their
Chernobyl,
morale shaken.
a permanent
For a
reminder
moment,
of the profound
it seemed as though the
perils of
Anglo-Saxons
nuclear
had
energy.
won the day.
The
Norman
Chernobyl
army,
disaster,
frustrated
in its
and
legacy,
bloodied, is a
seemed
final
to be on the
and
verge
most
of
profound
collapse.
warning. But
It is a
William was not a
testament
man
to the
to admit
immense
defeat.
and long-lasting
The Normans,
consequences
masters
of
of
single
both
catastrophic
war and
event,
deception,
The
employed
disaster
a
was a
cunning
story
and
of a
classic
world that was
tactic, the feigned
violently
retreat,
and
They
irrevocably
pretended to
changed
flee,
by a single
a desperate
mistake,
ruse
a
designed
story
to
that
lure
will
the
forever be a part of
Anglo-Saxons
the
from the
global
safety
narrative.
of their shield wall.
The
The
legacy of
Anglo-Saxons,
Chernobyl,
exhausted
in its
but
profound
emboldened
and
by their
long-lasting
success,
consequences,
made the fatal
is a
mistake
silent,
of breaking
powerful
formation
reminder that in
and
a
charging
world
down
of
the
immense
hill in
power,
pursuit.
Transparency
who
and
had been shouting
accountability
orders
are
to
not
hold
just
the line,
political choices,
could not stop his
but moral
men.
imperatives.
They were drawn into the trap.
The Chernobyl legacy,
their discipline
a
forgotten
final
in
warning,
the heat of
stands
the
as a
moment.
permanent
The Norman
and chilling
cavalry,
testament
which
to
had been
a world
hiding
that was
just out
violently
of sight and
suddenly
irrevocably
wheeled
changed,
around
and charged
its
into
shadow
the now
will forever be a part of the
disorganized
global narrative.
Anglo-Saxon army.
A silent,
The famed
powerful
retreat
reminder
was
of
the
a
turning
day
point
that
of the
changed
battle.
the world
The
forever.
men who had been an impenetrable
The Chernobyl
shield wall
disaster,
were
now scattered across the hillside, unprecedented
vulnerable
scale to the
and
Norman
global
reach.
The battle
turned
into a slaughter
and chilling monument. The
to the
Anglo-Saxons,
and
fighting a perilous relationship between humanity, were no match for the powerful Norman cavalry.
energy.
They were cut down.
It was a
by
tragedy
lances
born
and
not
swords,
of a random
their bodies
act of
littering
nature,
the ground,
but from
as
a
the
fatal
Norman
combination
forces,
of human
now
error,
emboldened by
a
their
deeply
success,
flawed reactor
pressed
design,
their advantage,
and a pervasive
despite
culture
the
of
immense
institutional
losses.
arrogance
A small
and secrecy.
contingent of the Anglo-Saxon
The explosions that
centered
tore
around
apart
King
reactor
Harold
Unit 4
and his
were a
brothers,
physical
managed
manifestation
to reform
of
a
systemic
systemic
failure,
shield wall
a
at the
tragic
top of the hill.
culmination of a
They
design
fought with a
philosophy
ferocious
that
determination,
prioritized ambition
holding their
over
ground
safety
against the
and a
relentless
political
Norman
system
assaults.
that valued
Their courage
image over the
defiant,
lives of its
defiant
citizens.
stand against the
The silent,
inevitable. The battle raged on into the late afternoon, unleashed upon the world was a direct consequence of this profound failure. As the day drew to a close, a silent, final, and lethal concentrated assault was launched against Harold the last stand. The details of his death are shrouded in some overwhelming tragedy and the immense human cost. Though this information has not been verified, more inspiring it is said that King Harold was struck in the eye by a Norman arrow, an army of sacrifice to be fatal. With little more than rudimentary protection and an unwavering the remaining Anglo-Saxon forces finally broke. Invisible war against the Battle of Hastings was over, is a testament and the Normans had won a courage and selflessness of ordinary people. The cost was immense, of unimaginable with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Their heroic efforts, but the consequences were performed under coercion. The Norman conquest had begun. Personal sacrifice. The age of Anglo-Saxon England, even greater period of over 600 years, as a powerful had come to an enduring symbol of the indomitable human spirit. One of French language. Their story is a Norman counterpoint and a profound change in the social and political fabric of the kingdom. Moving reminder about that even in the darkest of moments, had fallen. Humanity's capacity soon courage can shine through. The victory at Hastings, the Chernobyl disaster left a long, but it was not the end of the war. A permanent wound on the collective body and mind William of Normandy. Now it known fundamentally as altered the global conversation about nuclear energy, but he did not yet hold the crown of England. In public perception, the capital city and a new era of international cooperation on nuclear safety remained defiant. The health effects, its leaders, from the massive remaining Anglo-Saxon nobles to the long-lasting psychological trauma, a young boy, a chilling testament to the long shadow of the disaster. Edgar, a shadow that will continue to stretch across was a legitimate, if weak. The Chernobyl disaster, for William, in its legacy, this presented is a final and most profound warning. He could not simply march on London power of and expect energy comes surrender. In equally, he had to consolidate his victory, to manage it with humility, to submit to his rule, and an unwavering post-battle campaign was a masterclass. The Chernobyl disaster is not just a historical event. Instead of launching a direct assault on the fortified city, he embarked on a campaign of deliberate ambition and absolute through the necessity of safety and transparency. His army systematically ravaged. The story of Chernobyl is a final and most profound act of his forces burned villages, in its immense destroyed crops, has left a lasting legacy of courage. This ruthless campaign of intimidation was not a random act of violence. More transparent, it was a calculated strategy to demonstrate the futility of resistance. Stands as a permanent monument to a world that was violently isolating and irrevocably changed by a single mistake. Resist the Norman Duke. Powerful reminder of a day that changed the world forever. As his army drew closer, in the cold, the pre-dawn hours of London began to crumble. The Anglo-Saxon leaders, silent, seeing the devastation, force was facing a choice between submission, an event that would forever change the global conversation about technology. They surrendered the city and the very nature of human responsibility. In a final, imagine a time when the immense power they offered him the throne he had once come to the claim. Stuff of science fiction William, and military with a show of magnanimity, had been harnessed for peaceful purposes, promising the was now clear for his coronation. Clean energy, a symbolic act across that would legitimize his claim, a vast network of nuclear power plants. On Christmas symbolized Day, this 1066, a testament to the nation's technological the very church built by the man whose death had started the entire conflict. William the Conqueror, within this towering edifice of industrial coronation was a deliberate spectacle, a dangerous cocktail of Norman power with Anglo-Saxon failures. He was anointed with holy oil, a sacred ritual that presented him not as a foreign invader, but as a rightful, God-chosen monarch. The world was about to coronation, however, was just the beginning of nuclear energy when mismanaged and misunderstood. For years, rebellions and pockets of resistance flared up across the country. The disaster at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was not an act of their land, nor was William's response was swift, merciless. It was the culmination of a series of cascading failures. His most infamous campaign of events was the set in motion by human error, a brutal and systematic suppression of rebellion in the northern counties, and concealed by a culture his armies laid waste to vast swathes of land. The disaster burning itself, farms, a steam explosion followed by a and driving the population to was starvation. A physical manifestation of a deep policy of more such severity that it would be remembered for generations. The rebellion was crushed, an invisible cloud of radioactive particles was carried on the wind. The consequences of the Norman conquest that drifted across the irreversible, contaminating a tidal wave of change water that fundamentally transformed and leaving a trail of sickness and fear in its wake. Politically, William abolished the old Anglo-Saxon feudal system and replaced it with a new, clumsy centralized to contain the damage and he declared all land in England to be his personal property and then redistributed it to his Norman followers, within this creating a new aristocracy and the profound class that was loyal only to more inspiring story. This created a new social order. It was a story of extraordinary power that would dominate English ordinary men and women who, to maintain with little knowledge of the invisible construction of a vast network of breach to prevent great stone fortresses that served as visible. These were the symbols of Norman authority, an army of firefighters, towering walls, soldiers, constant miners who now engineers who, the Tower of London, more than rudimentary protection Norman rule, and an unwavering construction shortly after the conquest. In linguistically, war, the conquest created a linguistic divide that would forever change formed without full knowledge of Norman French became the language of the court, as a testament of to the remarkable of the human capacity for courage and selflessness. The language of the Anglo-Saxons, unimaginable danger, survived, but was relegated to the language of the common people. Filled with both heroism and linguistic stratification would eventually lead to a Chernobyl narrative, the two languages, a powerful counterpoint to French words enriching the vocabulary of Old English. This leading to the development chronicle of the Chernobyl disaster. Eventually, a story that intertwines the sterile, terrifying logic of the Normans brought with them a new style human narratives of architecture and legal systems. It is a story that reveals the delicate European culture that forever severed England's between scientific ambition and the absolute necessity of safety. The Battle of Hastings was not just a battle. We will delve into the fatal flaws of the hinge upon which the chain of events that history swung shut on the heroic sacrifices of the liquidators. It was a cataclysmic event, ongoing led to an irreversible transformation, a forging of a new. The Chernobyl disaster stands as a monumental at a small hill in Sussex, permanent reminder of the rise of a awesome power of nuclear energy, and unified kingdom with a new responsibility, a new to manage it with humility and a new aristocracy. And an unwavering that day would reverberate for centuries. It is a story that asks us to confront our own fallibility through its and to learn from the lessons of a silent disaster. The centuries that followed the Norman conquest saw Europe in constant flux. To truly comprehend the catastrophic events of April 26 struggles, and the inexorable rise, one must first delve into the very heart of the Chernobyl. The age of feudal kingdoms gave way to the age of empires, 1,000 reactors, and the stage of history, a machine of the green hills of England, fatally flawed in its cold plains of Eastern Europe. This specific in the early 18th century, a product of new Soviet engineering power had emerged in priorities. Was a technological paradox. Under the command of a it was capable of producing both brilliant amounts of electricity. Charles XII, as a byproduct, Sweden had become the military hegemon nuclear weapons program. Charles, but it lacked the fundamental safety features that were standard in Western had led his armies to a series of stunning victories. The disaster at Chernobyl making him one of the most feared and respected military minds of his generation. Almost inevitable. He was the Swedish lion, of a design philosophy in his own prioritized production, whose word was law and whose army seemed invincible and human oversight. Against this dominant force stood the immense, 1,000 historically underdeveloped Russian Mashnosti Kanalny. Its high-power channel Peter the Great was a man of moderated immense vision and ruthless ambition. Unlike Peter, the pressurized water reactors, a monarch determined to drag much of the Western world backward which used water as both a coolant. He had traveled extensively. The RBMK used graphite shipbuilding to moderate engineering, slow down military tactics. The neutrons in the nuclear chain was to build a Russian light water to secure a warm water port. This design had a legitimate, profoundly dangerous characteristic known the only as a standing in his way was the Swedish Empire, a positive which controlled the crucial that as the cooling water in the reactor core, the conflict turned into which would come to be known as the Great Northern War. The graphite began in 1700 when Peter the Great, causing the nuclear chain reaction to accelerate and the reactor's formed a coalition against the young Swedish king. In a stable, to reclaim the territories they have lost, the void coefficient would be negative, meaning that a loss of coolant only a teenager reaction. A natural safety mechanism, but an easy target. The RBMK design, in a series of stunning military campaigns, had a built-in feedback single-handedly that would amplify an operational error into a runaway he landed his army on the shores of Denmark, flaw so profound that it was a to surrender and withdraw from the war in a matter of weeks. Furthermore, he turned his attention to the Russian forces, a crucial massive army that was standard in Western reactors, that was laying siege to the Swedish-controlled fortress of Western reactors with an army of only 10,000 steel-reinforced concrete daring attack designed to contain storming the radioactive during a blinding event of an accident and routing the enemy. The Chernobyl reactor, however, the defeat was housed in a conventional industrial Peter the Great, with no robust, but it was also a moment structure to prevent a release of radioactive. He knew his army was no match for the Swedes. and he began a long
containment
and
building
arduous
meant
process
that once
of
the reactor
military
core
reform.
was breached,
With the Russians
release
defeated,
of radioactive
Charles spent
material
the next
into the
several
environment
years
was
campaigning
inevitable
against
and
the Saxon
catastrophic,
king, with forcing him to abdicate the Polish throne and
the
replacing
absence
him
of this
with the
key
Swedish
safety
puppet.
feature was a direct
Charles's
consequence of the
reputation
Soviet
as an
design
invincible
philosophy,
warrior king
which prioritized
was
a
now
low
unassailable.
cost.
He
He
had
had
defeated
defeated
every
model
enemy
that would meet the
and his
nation's
army was the
ambitious
finest fighting
energy
force
goals.
in Europe.
It was
Another
at this
fatal
point,
flaw in the
however,
RBMK
that he
design
made the
lay in
fateful
its control
strategic
rods,
decision
the
that
very
would prove
devices
to be
meant
his
to
undoing.
control and shut
Instead
down
of marching
the nuclear
directly
reaction.
on Moscow to force
The
a final
control rods
surrender
were
from
long
Peter the Great,
or on tipped
a
rods
move that his
designed
generals
to
absorb
advise.
neutrons,
Charles
and
chose
slow
to
the
invade
reaction.
Ukraine,
A
however,
vast
the
and
tips
wild
of these
territory
rods
to
were
the
made of
south.
graphite.
He planned to
which,
secure a
as a
new supply
moderator,
base for his
accelerated
army
the chain
and join
reaction.
forces with the rebellious
When the
Cossack
operators
leader,
attempted to
Ivan
perform
Mazepa,
an emergency
whose army had
shutdown
pledged
by
allegiance
inserting
to
the
him,
control
this
rod,
decision
the
proved to
graphite
be a
tips of the rods,
catastrophic miscalculation.
as they entered the reactor
Peter the
core
Great,
before the
a
boron
man of
absorbers,
patience and
caused a
resolve,
momentary
refused
but
to
dramatic
engage
surge
in a
power,
decisive battle,
an effect known
Instead,
as the
he employed a
scram-positive
brutal
effect.
but effective scorched earth
This
policy,
sudden power surge,
systematically
a direct
burning
consequence
crops and
of a
villages,
flawed control
denying
rod
the
design,
Swedish army
was the final
any chance of
fatal
resupply.
trigger that initiated
The
the
Swedish
chain of
invasion
events
turned
leading to
into
the
a
explosion.
slow, agonizing
The
march
RBMK
through a
reactor at
hostile and
Chernobyl was a
barren land.
monument to a
The
dangerous,
final, crushing
and
blow
ultimately
came in the
hubristic
winter of
design.
1708
It was a machine that
1709,
was inherently
one of the coldest
unstable,
winters in
unforgiving
European
of
history.
human error,
The Swedish
and
army,
lacked the most
far
basic
from its
safety
supply
features.
lines and already starving,
Its design was a
decimated
product
by
of a
frostbite,
command economy that
disease,
prioritized
and
production
starvation.
targets over
Thousands
safety.
of men,
A system
horses,
that discouraged
and wagons were
transparency
lost
and
to the
criticism.
unforgiving cold.
The men who
When
operated the
spring
reactor
finally
on that
came,
fateful
the
night
once
were
mighty
not fully
Swedish
aware
army,
of the
a
extent
force
of
of
these
nearly
design flaws.
80,000 men,
As much of the
was a
information
shadow
was
of its
classified
former self,
or simply
its
ignored.
numbers depleted,
The
and its
Chernobyl
morale
disaster
shattered.
was not
The
just an
long,
accident.
grueling
It was a
march had
systemic
led Charles
failure,
to the small,
a tragic culmination of a
fortress
design
of
philosophy
Poltava.
that,
He laid
in
siege
its pursuit
to it,
of power
hoping to
and
provoke
ambition,
Peter the Great
built a machine
into a final,
with a deadly,
decisive
and
ultimately
battle that would
unavoidable
somehow restore his
flaw at its
fortunes.
very core.
Peter,
whose
the
army had
RBMK
been
reactor
reformed,
was a ticking
re-equipped,
time bomb,
and was now
and
a
on April
disciplined,
26,
formidable
1986,
force, was no longer the
bomb
humble
finally
czar
went
of
off.
Narva. He had the
The
Swedes
RBMK
exactly where he
reactor's
wanted
design
them,
flaws,
weakened,
while critical,
isolated,
lay
and
dormant
desperate
for years.
A
On the
potential
fields
for
outside
disaster
of
waiting for the
Poltava,
right
the two
confluence
armies
of
finally came
circumstances
face
to be
to face.
unleashed. The Swedish
That
army,
confluence
its ranks
occurred on the
thinned
night
and
of
its
April
men
26th,
exhausted, was a wounded
1986,
lion during a routine but flawed
vulnerable
safety test.
The Russian army,
a series of
vast
human
in
errors
numbers and
procedural violations that would push the already
was a
unstable
slumbering
reactor
bear,
past its
patient
breaking
and
point,
ready to deliver a
this
final,
ill-fated
crushing
test,
blow.
a testament
fate of
to a
Sweden
culture
as
of
a
arrogance
superpower
and a dangerous
destiny of
disregard
Russia
for
as
safety
a dominant
protocols,
force in
was the
Eastern
direct
Europe
catalyst
about
for
to be
the world's
decided on the
worst
fields
nuclear
of
disaster.
Poltava.
In a clash
The tragedy
that
of
would forever
Chernobyl
alter
was
the
not
balance
just
of
a
power
failure
on
of
the
a
machine. It was
The
a
sun
failure
rose
of the
on
human
June
system
27,
that operated
1709.
The purpose of the
Illuminating
test
the plains
was,
outside
ironically,
the small
to
fortress of
improve the
Poltava,
reactor's safety,
a landscape that was about to become
Operators
the
were
graveyard
attempting
of
to
an
test
empire.
a new system
The two
that
armies,
would use the
which had
residual
stared at
energy
each other
from
across
spinning
the cold
turbines
distance
to power
of
the
a long
reactor's
winter,
cooling
were
pumps
finally
in the
arrayed
event
for
of an
battle.
emergency
The
shutdown
Swedish army,
and a loss
once
of
the
external
most
power.
feared military
This
force in
test
Europe,
was meant to
was a
simulate
pitiful
a power
shadow
failure
of its former
a
glory.
station blackout.
Its ranks were
to see if the
thin,
backup
its
cooling
soldiers
system
gaunt
would
from
function
hunger
as
and
designed.
hardship.
And their
The
great
test,
king,
however,
Charles
was
XII,
poorly planned,
who had led them to
poorly
so
managed,
many
and was being
improbable
conducted
victories,
under
was
immense
wounded,
time pressure,
having been shot
as the
in the
plant's
foot by a
managers were
Russian
eager to
sniper
complete the
just
test
days
before
the
the battle.
scheduled shutdown.
He was now carried on a
This
stretcher,
rush to meet a
wounded
deadline,
lion in a
common
cage,
feature in the
unable
Soviet
to lead his
industrial
men
system,
from the front,
led to a series of
psychological
shortcuts
blow
and
to a
dangerous
force that had
procedural
always drawn
violations.
its strength from the charisma
The chain of
and
errors
audacity
began
of
when
its king.
operators started the
The
test
Swedish
without
forces,
the proper
though
authorization,
diminished,
still
a blatant
possessed an
violation of
incredible
safety
fighting
protocols.
spirit. A resolve born
The
from
reactor's
years
power
of
was
victory
then lowered
and
to a
desperate hope
dangerously
that their
low
luck
level,
had not run
a
out.
condition that was
Facing
known
them
to
was
make
the
the
Russian
RBMK
army,
reactor
a new and
highly
vastly
unstable
improved force,
and unpredictable,
under the guidance
a
of
fact
Peter
that
the
was
Great.
not fully
They had been
understood by the
transformed from a
operators.
disorganized mob
The
into a
positive negative void coefficient, professional fatal fighting flaw machine. In the reactor's
They were
design
well-fed,
was at its most
dangerous,
and superior in every aspect of military might.
operators,
in their attempt to raise
chosen
the
his
power
battlefield,
building a series of reactors,
fortifications
and redoubts,
automatic
shutdown
a
Swedish attack,
including
provided
the emergency
deadly
platform
for his
system.
superior artillery.
They were operating
the Russian
in a
army
condition
was a force that was
no
violation
longer
of safety
just
regulations.
numbers.
Essentially,
It was now a
flying
force
blind
that
in
was
a machine
formidable
that was
in its
already
discipline
teetering
and
on
its
the edge
tactical
of
execution.
catastrophe.
As the test
proceeded,
the reactor
whose
became
ambition was as
increasingly
vast as his
unstable,
empire,
a
was
fact
on
that
the
was
field,
clearly
not as a
indicated by the
distant
control
monarch,
room
but as a
instruments.
hands-on commander.
The
Leading his
operators,
men in their
and
arrogance
inspiring them
and
with
their
his
belief
presence.
in their own
The
control.
battle began in the
chose to
early
ignore
hours of
these
the morning
warnings,
with a desperate,
believing that they could
all or
manage
nothing
the
attack
reactor
by the
manually.
Swedes.
The Swedish infantry, dangerously large number of control rods, launched a furious charge to control the reaction line, to raise the power weakened state. The reactor was now operating with a bare minimum of break through the first line of condition that was explicitly forbidden by their incredible courage and the lingering fear. Fatal error occurred just after 1:23 a.m. For a brief, shining moment. As the test was nearing its end, it seemed as though the invincible Swedish war machine emergency shutdown button live up, known as the AZ-5 button. But this was not the last-ditch effort to shut down the reactor. This was a new, a different, however, and a far due to the flawed design of the control Russian army with their graphite no longer tips, a green force. This action held its ground. Instead of shutting down the reactor, the turning point of the massive and the beginning of the end for the Swedish Empire, graphite tips the Russian artillery and as the Swedish forces became entangled in the Russian fortifications, power excursion, they were met with a devastating barrage of cannon coefficient. The Russian reactor to go positioned with uncontrollable precision, prompt criticality, a withering fire. The heat generated was so immense that it caused the cooling water to Swedish charge, which had carried them to so many victories, steam explosion was now halted that blew the 1,000-ton concrete lid off the reactor. And the Swedish forces, channels. Now disorganized, this was followed by a second, no longer more powerful explosion force. A hydrogen explosion caused by the reaction, a collection of brave men caught in a storm of iron alloy of the fuel rods. Seeing his tore apart the reactor building and exposed the core to the atmosphere. He personally led the Russian cavalry and infantry, but the disaster was just beginning. A tidal wave of fresh, the catastrophic chain of men that crashed born of a culture of arrogance, Swedish systemic failures. The battle turned into disregard for safety. The Swedish forces, the destructive power of nuclear energy upon the world, were completely outmaneuvered. The men in the control brutal and chaotic, ultimately scapegoated by the Soviet authorities. The pride of the Swedish Empire, flawed system they operated as they celebrated regiments, were annihilated. The Chernobyl disaster was a testament to the fact that catastrophe even the most for Charles XII powerful technologies as the battle devolved into a massacre. Human systems Charles XII and wounded and unable to lead. The ill-fated test was a tragic reminder that soldiers, in the face of humiliating and symbolic end for a monarch who had never known defeat. In the immediate, he fled with chaotic moments following the explosion. A broken king and a tattered courageous group of men became the first line of defense against the battle was visible and lethal. The Russian army had won a total. They could not see victory. Smell. The Swedish casualties were immense. These were the Chernobyl plant workers killed and the local firefighters, 16,000 ordinary men taken prisoner, including the vast majority of their high-ranking officers, rushed into the heart of the Swedish army, which had once been the fear of Europe, into a death trap of unimaginable radiation. The Battle of Poltava was more than heroic just a military defeat. Performed it was with a monumental shift in the balance of power in Europe, and with no proper definitive end of Sweden's reign as a dominant and tragic stories of the Chernobyl disaster, meteoric rise of the Russian profound courage that can emerge Peter the Great the prestige and the confidence. The explosions at 1:23 a.m. ripped the roof off his new capital of St. Petersburg, exposing the graphite core to the air, Russia's place on the European stage. Raging the Swedish lion had been vanquished, fire was not a conventional, and the Russian bear, awakened, it was a radioactive inferno, was ready to take its place among the great empires of the world, spewing a toxic cloud of radioactive was not just a battlefield victory. The first responders to arrive were the Chernobyl change in the destiny of two nations in a desperate and political map of an entire rush to the control room. The 18th century, to manually activate the reactors and emergency system, had slowly, all while the building around them was collapsing to a new world, and the radiation levels monarchical orders, which had dominated Europe for 1,000 years, they were met with a now being challenged by revolutionary ideas with glowing, radioactive graphite and national self-determination scattered all over the French Revolution, and a pervasive cataclysm that tore France apart in the air had shattered a phenomenon caused by the ionization of the air across the immense levels of from radiation. The chaos and fire simultaneously, of local firefighters from the nearby city of Pripyat arrived, a man who would forever change the course of European history, the power plant, Napoleon Bonaparte. He was a military genius of the highest firefighting uniforms, a man whose ambition no understanding of the nuclear nature of the fire. With an army of citizen soldiers, the roof he had redrawn the map of Europe, a roof that was covered in radioactive graphite debris from the forcing the ancient monarchies to their task was to extinguish the fires on the roofs. His name had been synonymous with the blaze from spreading to the other three reactors. Invincible, a critical and heroic force of nature that prevented a new kind of emperor who ruled not by divine right, for hours, but by the sheer, fought the blaze indomitable force of water and a profound but even the greatest of empires, their bodies absorbing and in 18 doses of radiation after a long, every ruling war of attrition. They were unaware that the water they were spraying was turning into radioactive by a coalition of European powers breathing was a deadly cocktail exiled to the small island of Elba in the Mediterranean. The effects of the radiation, the European monarchs were relieved and exhausted. gathered at the Congress of Vienna to turn back the symptoms of acute radiation order and erase the memory of the French Revolution and a metallic taste in their mouths. They believed they had finally put the ghost of their skin to rest, particularly their parts that were exposed to the highest levels of shifting sands began to turn a sickly, reddish color. The world held its breath for less than a year. In a move of staggering audacity and bravado, they continued to work. Napoleon escaped often in a state of confusion. He landed on the southern coast of France, driven by their training and their commitment to their duty. And from there began tragically, many of these first responders died a slow and agonizing death sent by the new king to arrest him. Instead, they were transported to specialized hospitals, disillusioned with the restored monarchy, many of whom were also unaware of the full extent of the radiation exposure. With their best to treat his force grew larger. His momentum having absorbed doses of radiation that were thousands of times higher than the lethal limit, began to break down at a charismatic personality. Their bone marrow was destroyed, triumph. Their immune systems collapsed. His dramatic return to power had begun. They were European powers in their tragic sacrifice were stunned. They declared Napoleon an outlaw. The first responders who had to be stopped disaster were not just heroes. They mobilized their armies for war, the first massive coalition that would once again converge on France. Their story is a forces converging on the new French Empire were the British armies of nuclear energy force and the immense courage that is required to pragmatic Duke of Wellington. Their sacrifice, and the Prussian army, made in the disciplined and chaotic moments of the disaster, under the command of prevented an even greater catastrophe and provided a crucial. Their goal was to unite their armies and crush example of the human spirit's capacity for selflessness. With a new army, but with the first responders genius in their heroic and tragic sacrifice, forces became a permanent fixture. His only hope was to defeat them in detail, to attack them separately before they could human cost and present a combined, overwhelming force. As the full scale of the disaster became audacious campaign into Belgium, the Soviet Union drive a wedge between the British and unprecedented human response. The initial engagements were a catastrophe and mitigated. At the Battle of Ligny, Napoleon was the army of liquidators, forcing them to retreat. Force of over 600,000 men from all walks of life did not panic and were not destroyed. Engineers, scientists, they retreated in good order. And in a moment of critical embrace of the Chernobyl to march to the aid of their British allies should the need invisible arise. War against at the same radiation. Time, a second French force clashed with the British at often coerced indecisive battle of a national effort to contain a disaster that was a direct result of the strategic landscape was set. They were now the British and Prussians were still separated. Their immense Napoleon had failed to deliver the knockout blow to either. Became a testament to a nation's desperate attempt to clean up the master of defensive tactics. The tasks of the liquidators were meticulous and incredibly dangerous. He positioned his army on a low ridge near the town of Waterloo. Was to contain the terrain that offered a strong defensive position and a clear line of sight over the approaching French army. Thousands of tons of sand. It was a perfect position for a defensive battle. A place where he could weather Napoleon's powerful charges, but ultimately ineffective. On the night of June 17th, as much of the material missed the core. A heavy rain. The liquidators were then tasked with turning the ground into a muddy temporary concrete, a final sarcophagus, ironic gift from the heavens destroyed reactor and contained the radioactive material and artillery in the morning. This was as the rain finally stopped and the dawn of June under immense pressure. The two armies, the last hope of Napoleon, one of the most dangerous jobs was clearing the highly radioactive graphite debris. The final chapter of Napoleon's epic was about to be a task that was initially would change the course of a continent forever. However, the morning of June 18th, radiation levels quickly destroyed the robots' cold and overcast, leaving the job to be done by hand. A heavy rain from the night truly terrifying display of human sacrifice. Clinging mud, the liquidators, a final, known as uninvited player in the grand drama about to unfold, were sent onto the muddy terrain was a strategic each man given a few minutes to run onto cavalry and artillery, shovel a single shovelful of radioactive debris off would be slowed and then run back to safety. He was forced to delay his attack, wearing rudimentary aprons and gas precious delay that offered little to no protection. Absorbed lethal doses arrayed in a well-chosen defensive position, a profound and tragic act of courage that was a multinational army of the Duke of systemic failures. It was a force of remarkable diversity. The liquidators were also tasked with decontaminating the and a large contingent of German soldiers, a 30-kilometer area bound together around by a common purpose that was heavily contaminated with radioactive fallout. The peace of Europe. They were
Wellington,
tasked with bulldozing
a master of
and
burying
entire villages,
had positioned his
stripping
army
the
on the
topsoil from
reverse
vast
slope of the
areas
ridge,
of land,
a tactic
and
that
killing
shielded
and
his
burying
troops from
all the
Napoleon's
animals in the
artillery
zone,
fire,
a
and
grim
hid their true
and
strength.
emotionally devastating
The battle
task.
began just before noon.
The work was
not with
performed
a frontal
under
assault,
immense pressure,
but with a
with little
diversionary
to no
attack
proper
on
Wellington's
Wellington's
right
rear,
flank,
and with the
an assault
constant
on the
terrifying
fortified
knowledge
farm
that
of
every
Hougoumont.
passing
What was
moment
intended
was a
as a
dose
feint
of radiation
quickly became
being
absorbed
into
into
their
bodies.
brutal battle.
The
A
information
ferocious,
about the dangers of
close-quarter struggle
radiation
for
was
control
often
of a single
suppressed or
farm that
downplayed
would
by
rage
the
for the
Soviet
authorities,
authorities,
who were
the
more
battle for
concerned with
Hougoumont,
controlling
a
the
relentless
narrative than
and
protecting the
bloody affair,
lives of the
drew a
men
significant
who were
number
risking
of French
everything
troops
for the
and
cleanup.
artillery away
The
from the
health
main
consequences
front,
for the
weakening
liquidators were
Napoleon's
immense
primary
and
attack.
long-lasting.
It was a battle of
Many
attrition
suffered
that
from
the
acute
French,
radiation
despite
syndrome,
their immense
ARS,
bravery and ferocity,
and many
could
more
not win.
developed various
The British
forms
defenders
of
of
cancer,
Hougoumont
including
held their
leukemia,
ground with an
thyroid
unshakable
cancer,
resolve,
and a host of other
a testament to the
radiation-related
discipline
illnesses.
of the men who fought
Their
for a
story
cause
is one
they
of a
believed in.
profound and tragic
As the day
betrayal.
wore on,
As many
Napoleon
of them were later
launched his
denied
main
the
assault
medical
on the
and
British
financial
center.
support
It
they were
was a scene
promised
of
by the
immense
Soviet
scale
and later
and brutal
Russian
beauty,
and
with
Ukrainian
massive
governments.
columns of French infantry.
They were heroes
finest
in
soldiers in
1986,
Europe,
marching
many
in
became
formation up
forgotten
the slope
victims in the
towards
decades
Wellington's
that followed.
hidden line.
Their illnesses
They were met with a
dismissed by the
withering
authorities
volley
as
of
cannon
cannon
fire
unrelated
and
to
the
their
disciplined
exposure.
volleys of the British
The
infantry,
liquidators of
who had been
Chernobyl
ordered
were
to
an
hold
army
their
of
fire until the
sacrifice,
last possible
a testament
moment.
to the immense
The French
courage
columns,
and selflessness
magnificent
of
in their
ordinary
advance,
people,
were
in the
shattered
face
by the
of an
precision of the
invisible,
British
lethal
volleys.
threat. Their formations
Their heroic
breaking
efforts,
into a chaotic
often
melee.
performed under
But
coercion
Napoleon's most
and with
powerful
profound
weapon,
personal
his heavy
sacrifice,
cavalry,
was
prevented
yet to
an
be
even
unleashed.
greater catastrophe
In a moment of
and provided a
strategic
crucial,
miscalculation,
albeit tragic,
Marshal Ney,
example
the French
of the
commander,
human spirit's
believed the
capacity
British
for
infantry was
resilience.
in retreat and launched
Their
a
story
massive,
is a permanent
all-out
fixture
cavalry
in the
charge.
narrative of Chernobyl,
The sight of thousands
a silent,
of French
powerful
cuirassiers,
testament
their
to the human
breastplates
cost
glinting
of a
in the
systemic
sun,
failure
thundering
and the
towards
immense
them
price
was
that
a
was paid to
terrifying
contain
sight.
it. But
The
Wellington's
liquidators,
men were ready.
in their tragic
The British
sacrifice,
infantry
in a
became the living
classic
legacy of
defensive move,
Chernobyl,
quickly
a
formed
permanent
into
reminder
squares,
of the
bristling
profound
with bayonets
perils
of
a
nuclear
formation
energy.
that was impenetrable to cavalry.
In the chaotic
the French
aftermath
cavalry,
of the disaster,
a force
an
that had won
invisible
so
and
many
lethal
victories,
boundary was
drawn
rendered
around
useless.
the Chernobyl
They could
nuclear
not
power
break the
plant,
squares,
creating
and their
a
repeated
permanent monument
desperate
to the
charges were
destructive
repulsed
power
with
of
immense
nuclear
losses.
energy.
The
The
Chernobyl
legendary
exclusion
cavalry
zone.
of Napoleon's empire,
This 30-kilometer
a symbol of
radius
French
around the
military
plant,
might,
was
was
broken
broken
and
profound and
As
eerie
the sun
silence,
began to sink in
was
the
a
west,
microcosm
a
of a
new
world
and
that had been
terrible threat
permanently
appeared on
altered by an
Napoleon's
invisible
right flank.
poison, the Prussians. It was a
Field
ghostly
Marshal
landscape,
Blucher,
despite his
capsule
defeat
of a
at
past
Ligny,
that was
had kept
violently
his promise
and
to his British
irrevocably
allies
interrupted,
and had marched
a
his
place
army
where
through the
nature,
difficult,
in the
muddy
absence
roads
of
to join the
humanity,
battle, had
the
begun
sight
to
of the
reclaim
Prussian
the
banners
land.
on the horizon
All while
was
the
a
silent,
moment of profound
lethal
relief
threat
for
of
Wellington's
radiation
men,
remained, and a moment
the
of
exclusion
devastating
zone stands as a
finality for
powerful
Napoleon.
and chilling
He
testament
had failed
to
to
the
defeat his
long-lasting
enemies
consequences
separately,
of
and
a
now he
single
faced their
catastrophic
combined
event.
might. With his
The
army
initial
exhausted
evacuation
and
of
the
the
city
city
of
of
beginning
Pripyat,
to press
a
his
model
flank,
Soviet city
Napoleon
built
made
for
a
the
final
plant's workers and
desperate
their
gamble.
families.
He
Was a
unleashed
desperate
his
and
elite,
clumsy affair.
most trusted troops
In the hours
the
and
Imperial
days
Guard,
following the
for one
explosion,
last,
the Soviet
glorious
authorities,
charge to
in a
break the
futile
British
attempt
line.
to control
The
the
Imperial
narrative
Guard
and
was the
prevent
very
panic,
embodiment
initially
of French
downplayed the
military
severity
prestige,
of the disaster.
a force that had never
But
been
as
defeated in
radiation
battle.
levels soared
They
to
marched with a
unimaginable
grim
heights,
determination.
the
up the
decision was
slope,
made to
a final,
evacuate the entire
magnificent
city
push to save their emperor and their empire. But
The
Wellington's
residents
men
were
held
told to
firm.
pack only
The
a
British
few
guards,
belongings,
a fresh,
as they would only be
professional
gone for a
force,
few days,
rose from behind
a lie
the
that was
ridge
meant to
and
prevent a
unleashed a
full-scale
series of
panic,
volleys that
but which
shattered the
ultimately
Imperial
became a
Guard's
cruel
formation.
and
For the
permanent
first time
deception.
in its history,
The
the
residents
Imperial
of
Guard was
Pripyat
left their
repulsed,
homes,
and its retreat
their possessions,
broke the morale
and their
of the
pets behind
entire
French army,
a testament
the
to a
cry
life
of
that was
La Garde
abruptly
recule,
and permanently
the Guard
put
is
on
in
hold.
retreat.
Was
Today,
the final,
the
devastating
devastating
nail
nail is a
in
ghostly
Napoleon's
landscape
coffin.
of abandoned
The
cities
battle
and
was
villages.
over.
The
chilling
French
army,
testament to the
routed and
destructive
broken,
power
fled
of
in a
radiation.
panicked retreat.
The
city
Prussian
of
army,
Pripyat stands
fresh
as a
and
time capsule of
unyielding, took up the
1986,
6. Ensuring that Napoleon would not be able to abandon schools with children's
for
books
Wellington
and DALL
and the
still
Allied
on the
forces was
and
total.
apartment
The
buildings
battle
that are
was a
slowly
devastating
being reclaimed
end to
by
Napoleon's
nature.
incredible reign.
The zone is a place
final
of
defeat
profound
that ended his
eerie
ambitious
silence,
vision of
with
a
the only
unified
sounds
Europe
being the
under French
rustling
rule.
of leaves.
It ushered
and the
in a
faint
long
hum of the
period
wind.
of relative peace.
The
beginning
buildings,
of a new
once
political
vibrant
order
and full
and the
of
rise
life,
of Britain
now
as the
stand
world's
as preeminent
preeminent
superpower.
a silent,
The battlefield
powerful
testament
Waterloo,
to a life
small,
that was violently
unassuming
interrupted.
stretch of Belgian
The
countryside.
radioactive
had
fallout
witnessed
from
the
the
end of a
disaster
long,
also created a
brutal
strange
era of war
and terrifying
and the beginning
phenomenon
of a new one.
The Red
The
Forest.
fall of the emperor was
A
complete,
large area
and the
of
stage
pine
was set
forest
for a
near
new
the
century,
plant,
which had
one that would be
absorbed the
shaped
brunt
by
of
the
the
decisions
radiation
made on that
turned a
single
reddish-brown
fateful
color
day.
and died.
The stories
A
of
physical
manifestation
manifestation
of
of
the
the
invisible
tours
poison
Hastings,
The trees were
Poltava,
later bulldozed
and Waterloo
and buried
are not
in a
merely
desperate attempt
isolated
to
tales
contain
of
the
combat.
contamination.
They are the
But the
resonant
forest
chords
remains
of
a
a vast
permanent fixture
historical
in the
symphony.
exclusion zone.
They are the hinges
a silent
upon which the
and
door
chilling
of
reminder
destiny
of the
swung.
destructive power
Moments of intense
radiation.
human drama that
Despite
forever
the
altered
lethal
the
levels
course
of
radiation.
nature,
In them,
in
we
the
find a
absence of
tapestry
humanity,
of enduring
has begun
truths,
to reclaim
a collection
the
of lessons forged in
The
the
exclusion
crucible of
zone is now
conflict
home
and
to a
ambition.
wide variety
We see
of
the birth
wildlife,
of an idea,
including wild
the fierce
boars,
defense of
wolves,
democracy on the
beavers,
plains of
and
Marathon,
rare species of
where the will
birds,
of a free
strange
people
and
proved to be a more
paradoxical
powerful
testament
weapon
to the
than
resilience
might
of an
nature.
empire.
That
However,
victory was a
the
seed
animals,
from which the
while
great
thriving
tree
in the
of
absence
Western
of
civilization would
interference,
grow,
are also
a
living
testament
in
to
a
the
highly
power of a
contaminated
collective
environment.
purpose.
With
We
many
see
of
the
them
stubborn
showing
endurance
signs
of
of genetic
culture in the
mutations
dark forests
and other
of Tome,
radiation-related
a
health
place
problems.
where a people's love for their
The exclusion
ancestral
zone
lands
is not a
proved stronger
pristine
than
wildlife
organized,
sanctuary.
disciplined
It is a
might of
laboratory
Rome.
for the long-term
That
effects of
battle drew a
radiation
line
on an
in the
entire
sand,
ecosystem.
a boundary that would
The
forever
exclusion
shape the
zone
ethnic
stands as a
and
political
permanent
map
and
of
chilling
Europe,
testament
a profound
to the
reminder
long-lasting
that some forms of freedom
a single
cannot be
catastrophic
conquered.
event.
In the clash of the
It
cross
is a place
and the
where the
crescent
past,
at tours,
present,
we
and
witness
future
a
have
pivotal
been
moment
forever
in the
intertwined
defense
by an
of
invisible
civilization.
poison.
A battle that ensured
It
the
is a place where
humanity's
humanity's
absence
and
has
cultural
created a
identity
strange
of a continent.
and paradoxical
It was a
landscape.
turning point that
a
set the
place where
stage for
nature's
a new
resilience
European
is both
order,
a source
a
of
reminder
hope
of
and
the
a
immense
profound
gravity
warning.
of a single,
The exclusion
decisive
zone
moment.
is a final,
The story
and
of
most
Hastings
enduring,
is a poignant
monument
reminder
to the
of how a
destructive
single
power
day
of nuclear
can fundamentally
energy,
reshape
a silent,
a nation.
powerful
The
reminder
arrow
of
that
the
felled an
immense
Anglo-Saxon
and long-lasting
king not
cost
only
of
ended
a
a
single,
dynasty,
but also
catastrophic
ushered
mistake.
in a new language.
Its ghostly
a new
landscape
legal
will
system,
forever
and
stand
a new
as a
culture,
testament to
a change
world
so
that was
profound that
violently
its legacy
and
is
irrevocably
still visible
changed.
in the very fabric
In the chaotic
of England today.
aftermath of the disaster,
Poltava, with
in
the
turn,
reactor core
shows
still
us the
a
brutal
raging
and
radioactive
irreversible nature
inferno.
of a shift
The
in
immediate
global
priority
power,
was to
the end of a
contain the
great
immense
empire
release of
and the
radioactive
dramatic birth of a new
material
one.
and provide some
It was a
level of
lesson in the
protection for the
fragility
surrounding
of
environment.
military genius
The
and the
solution,
immense power
conceived
of
in a
patience
moment of
and
desperate
strategic
necessity,
reform,
was
Finally,
a massive,
at Waterloo,
temporary concrete
we see the
and
end of
steel
an era,
structure known
the fall
as
of
the
a man whose
sarcophagus,
ambition
a
had
hastily
reshaped
built
the
tomb
continent.
designed
It was
to
a battle
entomb
that
the destroyed
closed the book
reactor
on the age
and
of
its lethal
Napoleonic
contents.
warfare and ushered
This
in a long,
monument to
albeit
containment,
imperfect,
a product of
period
immense
peace,
human effort,
reminding
and
us that
profound
even the
sacrifice,
greatest of men
was a
and the
Herculean
most
effort to contain
ambitious
a
of
disaster
can be
of
brought down
unimaginable
by a
scale,
combination
a
of
testament to a
circumstance,
nation's
strategy,
desperate
and
attempt
relentless
to clean up
opposition.
its own mess.
These battles are more
The
than
construction
dates
of the
and
sarcophagus
names.
was a
They are the
monumental
echoes
and
of humanity's
unprecedented
journey.
engineering
They
challenge,
speak to our
performed
capacity
in
for
a
both
lethal
immense
environment
violence
of intense
and
radiation,
extraordinary courage.
to our
The task
relentless
fell to the
drive
liquidators,
to build, an
and to
army
our
of soldiers,
terrifying ability to
miners,
destroy.
and engineers
They teach
who
us
worked
that
in
history
shifts,
is not a
with each
static
man
list of
given
facts,
a few minutes
but a
to
living,
work before being
breathing story
rotated
of
out
choices
to
made
limit
by
their
individual
individuals under the
exposure.
weight of destiny.
The men,
The lessons
wearing
of these
rudimentary
turning
lead
points,
aprons
of these
and
moments
gas
of high
masks
drama,
that offered little
resonate
to no
still.
protection.
They remind us
tirelessly,
that the
their
world we
bodies
inhabit
absorbing
today,
lethal
with its
doses of
political
radiation,
systems,
with
its
every
borders,
passing moment.
and its cultural
The
identities,
work was
is a
performed
direct
under
result of
immense
the blood
pressure,
and steel
with the
of
constant,
1,000
terrifying
battlefields.
knowledge that
And in
every
their
passing
memory,
moment
we
was
find
a dose
powerful,
of radiation
humbling,
being absorbed
and
into their
inspiring
bodies.
truth.
That
The
the human
sacrifices
spirit,
of these men,
in all its
who risked their
complexity,
lives to
remains
contain
the
the disaster,
single greatest
are a
force
central
in the
and
story
tragic
of our
part of the
world.
Chernobyl